the UK also plays a leading role in making sure that people who are affected by those crises have adequate and the long-term support that they need. This is important because, Mr. Speaker, a humanitarian high-level panel looking at these issues made the point that there are now 125 million people in the world who live through humanitarian support. That's the equivalent of a country, but they don't have a head of state at the UN speaking up for them, and that's why the rest of us need to work as hard as we can to make sure that they're not only listened to, but that their needs are met.
Diane Abbott.
The Secretary of State will be aware that the biggest humanitarian crisis facing us is the refugee crisis, and the House respects the work the government has done with the Syria conference and investing in the camps. But what about those refugees, particularly child refugees, who are not in the camps? We have heard this week that for the first time since the crisis began, women and children make up the majority of refugees travelling to Greece. How many child refugees who are not in the camps is the government proposing to take?
Well, on the broader issue, she'll know that the UK set up with UNICEF the No Lost Generation initiative, which has enabled now half the children affected by the Syrian crisis to be able to be in school, and more broadly on the relocation scheme that we've put in place, which is the right way to help vulnerable refugees relocate out of the region if they need to. It's working with the UN agencies to identify the most vulnerable people. We're now talking with them about how that can be extended to unaccompanied children. But I think broadly the good news is, because of the hard work of agencies like UNICEF, funded by the UK, overwhelmingly over 85% of children who do arrive in countries like Jordan and Lebanon unaccompanied are able to finally meet up with their families and get reunited again.
Andrew Bridgen. 3, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, two-thirds of Africa does not have access to electricity, and DFID wants to play a leading role in changing that, including through the Energy Africa campaign, which will accelerate the market for transformative household solar systems and so contribute to the global goal of universal access by 2030.
John.
Mr. Speaker, would the Minister outline to the House what opportunity he sees for British entrepreneurs and British companies to help his department achieve its ambition of ending fuel poverty in Africa?
I thank you for that question. In fact, one of the things we're most excited about, for example, in the Energy Africa campaign, is that some of the most effective leadership we're seeing on the continent are by companies that are British or set up by British or backed by British, including Azuri Technologies, M-Copa, and of course DFID's commitment to ongoing research of about £100 million through Mission Innovation Initiative will create opportunities for many British companies to be involved in that important research.
Mr. Gregory Campbell.
Speaker, can the Minister confirm if discussions are taking place with African nation states to ensure that solar energy becomes a high priority in those states, and we can help and give assistance to very much needed energy supplies to the residents of those nation states?
I can certainly confirm that. In fact, I've had a number of bilateral meetings with African ministers, and indeed have signed up 7 countries to the Energy Africa campaign, which is all about accelerating the access that their citizens have to household solar systems that, in my experience, I've seen this in Ethiopia, can absolutely transform the prospects for a family. It's a high priority for them and for us.
Barry Sherman.
Mr. Speaker, can I ask the Minister to broaden his horizons? That we have so much expertise in this country, in universities, in big energy and waste companies, and a lot of social enterprises that know about this stuff. Bring them together, give us the opportunity to help people in Africa to set up themselves.
I'm absolutely with him, as on many things. There's a huge amount of expertise in this country that we can and should and want to connect to leaders in African countries who know that making it easier for their citizens and their businesses to access energy is absolutely fundamental to development. It's a top priority for us.
Mr. Patrick Grady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. DFID's inclusive growth diagnostic identifies energy access as a major blockage to inclusive growth, and CAFOD's research with small businesses in developing countries identified lack of access to reliable electricity as one of the top 10 barriers to development. So while welcoming DFID's support for household solar power, how does DFID plan to expand this, for example through clean cooking technology? And what steps are they taking to prioritise clean energy across the board, rather than carbon-intensive and fossil fuel generation in developing countries, to ensure we don't undermine climate change targets?
Yes, I've mentioned the Energy Africa campaign, but that is just one piece. The household solar system is just one piece of the DFID offer to Africa, which I think totals over £1.5 billion worth of investment, and particularly in renewable energy, a contribution to the African Renewable Energy partnership of around 2 gigawatts, connecting about 20 million people through that initiative alone. So the DFID offer goes broader than household solar and encompasses a wide range of renewable technologies.
Mr. Lawrence Roberts.
Question number 4, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, 80% of the population are in need of humanitarian aid. 7.6 million face severe food shortages. 320,000 children under the age of 5 are severely malnourished. There are 2.5 million displaced people, and there were 8,000 civilian casualties last year. It must be one of the least eligible places to be.
Mr. Lawrence Roberts.
I thank the Minister for setting out the very worrying situation in the Yemen. Given the other problem areas of the world, such as in Syria, isn't it the fact that it is one of the hidden problems of the world? What can the government do to enable NGOs to get at least food aid and clean water into Yemen to those people who are so desperately in need?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we started by doubling our aid last year, and the Secretary of State announced last week it would increase by a further 10 million to 85 million pounds. She led a side event at the UN General Assembly in September, which she secured from other donors a further 85 million. We're working on the UN verification and inspection mechanism to ensure that more food and more shipping get into Yemen.
Stephen Twigg.
Additional aid is welcome, but at the same time we are supplying arms to one side in the conflict. Isn't it time that this country supported an international independent inquiry into the concerns about the abuses of international humanitarian law, and in the meantime suspend all arms sales to Saudi Arabia?
Mr. Speaker, we've supported the UN Human Rights Council resolution, which requires the government of Yemen to investigate with the support of the UN.
Helen Grant.
DFID's very good work in the Yemen being undermined by UK arms sales to Saudi Arabia.
Mr. Speaker, what undermines UK aid, what makes it ever more necessary yet harder to deliver, is the violent and unlawful removal of the government of Yemen. And only a peace process to restore it will end the suffering.
Gisela Stewart.
If we are concerned about arms exports to Saudi Arabia, which fuels the conflict in Yemen, why is the government not pressing ahead with setting up the cross-party quadripartite committee on arms exports so Parliament can actually control this better?
Speaker, as the Prime Minister has pointed out, we have the most stringent and robust arms export regulations in the world. We have supported the UN Human Rights Council resolution. We are absolutely committed to the investigation of every abuse or abrogation of international law.
Diane Abbott.
The Minister will be aware that Safe for World, Oxfam, UNICEF and Save the Children take the position that DFID's work in Yemen is being undermined by UK arms sales. How does the Minister continue to insist that a UK replenished Saudi arsenal being dropped on Yemen is not an impediment to development?
As I've said to the Honourable Lady, the undermining of the ability to deliver aid is a consequence of warfare. That warfare arises because of the violent removal of the lawful government of Yemen, not because we've sold arms to the Saudis.
Sir Oliver Heald.
Number 5, please.
No country can develop whilst half of its population is locked out of that. That's why I placed improving the prospects for girls and women around the world at the heart of DFID's work, and I'm honoured to have been recently appointed to the new UN high-level panel on women's economic empowerment by the Secretary-General, joining leaders of the World Bank, the IMF, private sector and civil society to drive this agenda forward.
Heald.
My right honourable friend agree that there needs to be in the poorest countries a particular focus on rural development and on agriculture, because it's women who produce most of the food and have the security of it as their responsibility. And does she agree that if we can improve the productivity of women and empower them, then we can reduce poverty and we can see growth in countries that need it?
He's absolutely right, and of course agriculture is a key economic sector of most of those countries. There was a recent report by McKinsey that said that if you achieve gender parity at a regional level, so each country was matching the best progress of the best country in its region, that would add 11% to global GDP by 2025, a huge economic lever for all of us to pull.
Mary Cray.
The Zika virus crossed the Pacific and went from French Polynesia to Brazil in May last year. Since then, 4,000 children have been born with microcephaly. What analysis has she made of the risks to the poorest women and girls in the world if that virus crosses the Atlantic from Brazil to sub-Saharan Africa? And will she promise to keep a very close eye on that and use all British scientific knowledge to ensure that that does not happen?
Well, she's absolutely right, and of course we had an urgent question on this earlier in the week when my honourable friend set out the research that we're now kicking off. But she'll also be pleased to hear that Chris Whitty, who was then the DFID chief scientist leading our work on Ebola and helping us shape that response, is currently in Brazil talking to authorities there about making sure we manage these various risks that she sets out.
This is Caroline Spellman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the Secretary of State commend the work of Tear Fund in Bangladesh amongst women in rural areas, helping them with business startups and working with the government of Bangladesh to provide mobile phone banking to cut out the middleman?
Well, she's mentioned a number of very innovative pieces of work that are going on, and I do commend Tear Fund Forex work. Healthy economies need everybody able to be part of them, and that's why women's economic empowerment matters so much.
Andrew Gwynn.
But what efforts is she taking to ensure that other donor countries, the EU, the UN, the World Bank, integrate gender into their humanitarian efforts?
Well, of course, the fact we now have Global Goal 5 on gender equality means that for the very first time this is actually on the world's to-do list formally, and the World Humanitarian Summit is a key moment when we can make sure that the vulnerabilities, particularly of girls and women, are properly pulled into the humanitarian system in terms of its response on the ground. He'll be aware that 2 years ago the UK held a conference on this very topic to drive this forward.
Hasmina Ahmed Sheikh.
Question number 6, please, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, DFID funds a number of organisations in Yemen in order to deliver aid. Some of them have reported alleged breaches of international law and human rights.
Hasmina Ahmed Sheikh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government has so far approved £5,600 million worth of arms sales to Saudi Arabia, which several independent reports have connected to the bombing of civilian targets in the Yemen. Given this figure and these independent reports, does the Minister believe that £75 million of aid delivered by the UK to the Yemen represents a balanced approach to the conflict by this government?
Actually, Mr. Speaker, it's 85 million. 85 million of life-saving aid. And that aid is made more difficult to deliver by warfare. And that warfare is a consequence of the violent removal of the lawful government of Yemen, not anything that the United Kingdom has done.
Sir Alan Duncan.
Speaker, may I invite the Minister to reiterate that point, that the greatest breach of international law in Yemen has been the removal of a legitimate government by force, and that although it's very, very easy to focus only on the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and blame them, it is that initial use of force which has caused this problem and must be seen in the context of the solutions we now want to see around the negotiating table.
He's absolutely right, and can I pay tribute, Mr. Speaker, to his work as the Prime Minister's Special Representative and the enormous amount that he has done to bring peace and prosperity to Yemen.
Topical questions, Mr. Christopher Pincher.
Number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 2 weeks ago at the World Economic Forum, alongside the UN Secretary-General and the President of the World Bank, we launched the UN's high-level panel on women's economic empowerment. Last week, I joined my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, and Bill Gates to set out our new commitment on malaria, which will save lives and build a safer, healthier world. And finally, Mr. Speaker, tomorrow, the UK will co-host the Syria Conference, bringing together world leaders to resource the life-saving humanitarian support, create jobs and provide an education for millions of people and children whose lives have been torn apart by this devastating civil war. All of this, women's economic empowerment, malaria being steadily eradicated, Syrian refugees supported to stay where they want to in their home region, is firmly in the UK's national interest.
Christopher Pincher.
Mr. Speaker, if the refugee crisis in Syria is not to become a permanent exodus, its people must be given hope of a better future. Can my right honourable friend say what hope she is giving for greater job opportunities in Iran?
Well, we hope that we'll be able to take a big step forward on announcing agreements with both Jordan and Lebanon, that in return for them taking political steps forward on enabling Syrian refugees to work legally, that we'll be able to then mobilise international finance to create those jobs in those countries, not just for Syrian refugees, but also for host communities too, which is going to be in everyone's interests.
Mike Kane.
Mr. Speaker, Malawi is the poorest country on the planet, yet our 1955 tax treaty between the UK and Malawi severely limits their ability to raise taxes on UK companies based there. Will the Secretary of State commit to looking at this issue of the treaty and making it fit for the 21st century?
Well, this issue of domestic resource mobilisation and taxes is something that we very much wrapped up DFID's work on over the last few years. I set up a joint unit with HMRC that now sees HMRC officials working with countries to help them drive their tax revenues up. We're going to continue that support, particularly in Africa, over the coming months.
Raymond Chishti.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. DFID do a brilliant job in Pakistan on education and health. Will the Minister meet with the excellent UK charity, the Noor Foundation, which help 1,000 people in Pakistan every year with kidney dialysis?
Well, I'm sure we'd be delighted to have the group that he talks about come into DFID. As he sets out, we have a very big programme with Pakistan, but it is steadily enabling that country to make sure that its people are educated and healthy, which are two of the strongest foundations for aid independence in the longer term.
Fiona McTaggart.
In response to an earlier question, the Secretary of State said that she is working to protect Syrian children in refugee camps in the region. But she's aware that Europol report that 10,000 children of Syrian extraction registered in Europe have disappeared and are at risk of sexual and other criminal exploitation. What's she doing to protect them?
Well, she'll be pleased to hear that we've worked directly with the UNHCR on improving registration so that we don't lose people, including children, who've arrived. And of course, we've done a huge amount of work to make sure that people also have access to some of the basics that they need when they make it over to Europe by working with the Red Cross. So I think she can be proud of the work the UK is doing, but of course the bulk of our work is in the region itself, which is overwhelmingly where people and refugees want to stay, close to home.
Mrs. Flick Drummond.
Mr. Speaker, following the new parliament in Myanmar, what plans has the UK government got to put in place to help that country move forward with development?
Well, the elections are an important step towards both greater democracy and also gives us a chance to really support inclusive growth in Burma. So we're supporting improvements in the business climate, including the financial sector. We're also helping to increase agricultural productivity, to diversify livelihoods and encourage more private sector investment in infrastructure.
Jim Cunningham.
What's the government doing to help end the blockade of Gaza?
Well, he raises a very important point. Having a viable economy in Gaza is one of the best ways we can enable many of the challenges that people living there to be faced effectively. In the meantime, the UK, of course, provides key support to UNRWA and also works directly with the Palestinian Authority. And of course, it's critical that in the end those blockades are removed so that we can have a normal situation that enables the Gaza Strip in particular to get back on its feet.
Dowden.
Thank you. As the civil war in Syria continues, does the Secretary of State agree with me that we should use our aid budget to support refugees, but we should also be urging countries in the region to issue work permits so that refugees can rebuild their lives there rather than making the perilous journey to Europe?
He's absolutely right. People, wherever they are, deserve the dignity of work, and that goes for refugees. I've met people who were in the middle of economics degrees and suddenly found themselves living in a camp in Lebanon, camps in Jordan. Those people want to support themselves. If we can take a big step forward tomorrow on enabling work to happen legally, then not only are we helping those countries like Jordan and Lebanon, we're also helping the refugees who are currently there.
Order. Questions to the Prime Minister. Mr. John Mann.
Shall we begin, Mr. Speaker, with question 1?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, and in addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
John Mann.
Is that... Mr. Speaker, is that it? Is it the best the Prime Minister can do? Nothing for British pensioners, nothing for British workers, and as the Office for Budget Responsibility and the Treasury have both confirmed, his long-term economic plan is reliant on over 1 million new migrants entering this country before 2020. Has the Prime Minister got the bottle to confirm this inconvenient truth?
Well, I tell you what we're doing for pensioners, and that is a triple lock on pensions. Never again the 75p rise they got from Labour, but either prices or wages or 2.5%. I can tell you what we're doing for people who want to work hard in Britain. That is create 2.3 million more jobs since I became Prime Minister. But yes, of course, I believe that we'll succeed more as a country if we get a good deal in Europe and stay in a reformed Europe. That will be good for jobs, good for investment, good for growth. And that's what I'm fighting for.
Marcus Fish.
People in my constituency of Yeovil are rightly proud of their contribution to the defence of our country, whether through the skill and readiness of the Fleet Air Arm at Yeovilton or the local high-tech industry making and maintaining helicopters and equipment for our ships, submarines and aircraft and those who bravely serve in them. In the current circumstances of increasing security challenges and responsibilities and a worrying lack of commitment to defence in many European countries, I welcome the leadership the government has shown in committing to spend 2% of GDP on defence, and ask whether my right honourable friend will meet with me to discuss ideas I have to build on local capability.
My honourable friend is absolutely right that Yeovil makes a huge contribution to the defence of our country, not least through Augusta Westland, which is a great British business. We are committed to spending £178 billion on defence equipment over the next decade, something we're only able to do because we've got a strong economy. We've committed to that 2%, and we'll make sure the money's well spent, making sure that we have the right equipment for our brave armed forces.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tomorrow, Mr. Speaker, is World Cancer Day. Cancer is a disease that almost every family in this country has been affected by in some way or another. 2.5 million people in this country have cancer. There are members on both sides of this House who have received or are receiving treatment at the present time. 1,000 people a day are diagnosed with cancer, and they go through a trauma as soon as they're diagnosed. But in the last year, there's been a 36% increase in the number of people waiting beyond 6 weeks for vital diagnostic tests. Could the Prime Minister do something to bring that down?
Well, first of all, I completely agree with the right honourable gentleman that the fight against cancer is one of the great fights of our time, and it's one we are determined to win. Now, when we look at how we treat cancer in our country, we're putting an extra £19 billion into our NHS, and specifically, while he's absolutely right, everyone in this House and every family in this country will know someone who's been affected by cancer, we are treating more patients. And let me give him the figures. Compared with 2010, over 645,000 more patients with suspected cancers have been seen. That is an increase of 71%, and almost 40,000 more patients have been treated for cancer. That is an increase of 17%. We've got more doctors, more nurses, more cancer specialists, but the fight against cancer is something we need to continue with.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, early diagnosis is absolutely essential in dealing with cancer. I think on that we all know. We know from personal experience on this. The government's independent task force into cancer reported last year, and I quote, "We currently have a serious shortage of radiologists in England. We need more of them." So could the Prime Minister explain why we're cutting by 5% the number of training places available for therapeutic radiographers?
We need more radiologists, and we're getting them because we're putting more money into the NHS. But where he's absolutely right is that waiting times... A minute ago, the Honourable Lady was shouting about waiting times, and I'm going to answer the question on waiting times because there are three key targets on waiting times. First, that people should be seen by a specialist within 2 weeks of an urgent GP referral, and that we're meant to meet on 93% of occasions. We're currently meeting on 94.7%. We need to make sure the first treatment comes within 31 days of diagnosis. That is extremely important. There's a 96% standard, and that we're meeting by 97.7%. But I accept when it comes to the first treatment within 62 days, the standard's 85%, we're at 83.5%, so we need to improve our performance. Now, when it comes to training, we're increasing training places in our NHS. We discussed nurses last week, where we're actually opening up nurse training by making sure we train an extra 10,000 nurses. But the crucial point here is the money is there in our NHS because we've got a strong economy. 19 billion more, money that would never be there if we followed his crazy economic plans.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, my specific question was on therapeutic radiographers. The Prime Minister did not answer that. Without an improvement in the numbers available, there will be a problem over treatment. That must be very obvious to absolutely everybody. The Cancer Task Force also asked, and I quote, for a radical upgrade in prevention and public health. Programmes like stopping smoking and anti-obesity are absolutely essential to stop the spread of cancer and indeed to help people to live better lives so they don't develop cancer at all. But if we cut, as he's proposing, £200 million from the public health budget, surely that is going to lead to an increase in cancer with all the trauma that goes with that and indeed the greater cost for the rest of the community. Could he explain why he's making this cut?
Well, first of all, let me just come back to on diagnostic radiographers, because there are actually 1,800 more diagnostic radiographers than when I became Prime Minister in 2010. And for the interests of fact, that is a 15% increase. And the reason there's an increase is that we said we would put more money into the NHS, a real terms increase, something that we were told by the then Shadow Health Secretary was irresponsible. Now, we ignored Labour and we put money into the health service, and as a result, there's been a 15% increase in diagnostic radiographers. Now, when it comes to the rest of the cancer plan, the money is being invested. There's a key difference, though, between England and Wales and something he can help with, which is there's a Labour government in Wales. And whereas we've got a cancer drugs fund, they have no cancer drugs fund in Wales. So he needs to sort that out with that Labour administration. As for public health, under this government, real advances have been made on public health, including smoking rules in the backs of cars, including plain paper packaging, including ring-fencing public health budgets, all done under the Conservatives, not done under Labour.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is responsible for the health service in England. Wales is a devolved matter, and he must be aware must be aware that cancer survival rates are improving better in Wales than in any other part of the UK. But my question was... My question, Mr. Speaker, was about the cut in public health budgets and the effect that has on cancer care. So, could the Prime Minister tell us when was the last time that the NHS target for starting cancer treatment was actually met within the 62 days required?
Well, as I've said to him, of the three big targets, we're meeting the specialist within 2 weeks target, we're meeting the first treatment within 31 days of diagnosis treatment, we're currently falling short of the 62 days target, something which I actually said in the answer to question 2, but he hasn't got round to it till question 5. I think the cogs need to turn a little bit faster. Now, he cannot wash his hands for the situation in Wales. Labour run Wales. And what have Labour done in Wales? Labour have cut the NHS in Wales. Now, it's now emerging what Labour's great plan is. They want to cut the NHS in Wales, and they want to put up income tax on hard-working people in Scotland. That's right. What are they going to do to radiographers in Scotland? Put up their taxes. What are they going to do to nurses in Scotland? Put up their taxes. What are they going to do to dentists in Scotland? Put up their taxes. We now know Labour's plan. Higher taxes for more welfare. They've learnt nothing in the last decade.
Mr. Speaker, the last time the 2-month target was met was 19 months ago. The Prime Minister must be aware of that, and I'm pleased if he's taking action to make sure that doesn't continue or get any worse. I want to turn to another issue that affects cancer patients, and that is the recently deleted provisions in the Welfare Reform and Work Bill that would have taken £30 per week from ESA claimants in the work-related activity group. Martin contacted me this week, who says, OK, it's very funny for many members opposite. It's not funny for Martin. Martin has a close friend who has breast cancer and, I quote, is obviously too unwell to work, and cuts will put her into hardship at a time when she's most vulnerable. There are 3,200 people with cancer hit by this cut to the ESA. Will the Prime Minister now confirm when that matter returns to the Commons, he will ensure the Lord's position is upheld and people like her do not suffer the cut that he wanted to make in the first place?
Let me explain to the right honourable gentleman and to the House the situation. As everybody knows, there are two sorts of employment and support allowance. There are the work-related activity group, who are able to train for some work, and then there's the support group, who go on getting employment and support allowance indefinitely. That is the situation, and what we've said is that in future, the work-related activity group should be paid at the same rate as job seekers' allowance. But that is for future claimants, not for existing claimants who continue to be paid at the same rate. And of course, if someone has cancer and can't work, they should be in the support group. And we've had this issue looked at again and again and again, and they should be, if they can't work, they go on getting the welfare payments they need. That is what a compassionate Conservative government does. But I have to come back to him, because he cannot wash his hands for the situation in Wales. Hip operations in England take 75 days waiting times on average. In Wales, it's 197 days. Diagnosis of pneumonia takes 2 weeks longer. Treatment of cataracts, hernias, heart operations take 2 months longer than in England. Labour are running Wales. He's responsible for Labour. Pick up the phone, tell them to stop cutting our NHS.
Mr. Speaker, it's very interesting the Prime Minister did not answer the question I put, which is whether or not he will proceed with the cut in ESA to 3,200 people with cancer at the present time. I hope he thinks seriously about this and does not proceed with this proposal. he will find that Macmillan Cancer Support, Rethink Mental Health Illness, Parkinson's UK are all united in opposing this cut because of the effect it will have on people with a range of very serious conditions. The Prime Minister used to say that those with the broadest shoulders should bear a greater load. Can it be right that cancer patients and those with disabilities on £102 per week really are those with the broadest shoulders who should bear this cut? Please, Prime Minister, think again and don't try and reverse the decision of the House of Lords on this important matter.
The people with the broadest shoulders are the highest earners in this country, and they're paying a higher share of tax than they ever did under Labour. And that money is paying for our NHS, is paying for our welfare system. And I answer the question very directly. If you're an existing claimant on employment and support allowance, your welfare isn't changing. But in future, those people who are able to get back to work, we should help them to get back to work. That is what a compassionate country does. But it's quite clear what Labour's policy is. Cut the NHS in Wales, put up taxes in Scotland to pay for more welfare. That's not the approach that this country needs.
David Warburton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend will, of course, know that the West Country is becoming ever more the envy and the engine room of the rest of the country, with dozens of companies moving from the dark recesses of London to the bright sunlight of the West. So will he keep supporting what they're now calling Somerset's Silicon Gorge by maintaining investment in our roads, in our rail and, of course, in our digital infrastructure?
Well, certainly keen to support Silicon Gorge. For a moment, I thought it said Silicon George for a moment. I was a bit worried about that. But look, I think it's absolutely essential we have a balanced economy, and that means a strong economy in the west of our country, as well as in the south, as well as in the north. We are investing in the vital transport infrastructure, not least the vital roads to the West Country, and improving rail links as well, as I saw for myself yesterday in Chippenham. But we also need to make sure that this broadband rollout is really effective across the country, and that has got to be a big focus. Getting to those last 10% of homes in so many rural areas is going to be absolutely crucial to make sure they're not left out.
Mr. Angus Robertson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The timing of the forthcoming European Union referendum is extremely important. Today, the First Ministers of Scotland, of Wales and of Northern Ireland have jointly called for a commitment by the UK Government not to hold the EU referendum in June, which would clash with elections to the devolved legislatures. Will the Prime Minister give that commitment today?
Well, first of all, there is no agreement, and so no date has yet been fixed for the referendum. We discussed this a lot in this House of Commons, and we legislated to make sure we wouldn't hold the referendum at the same time as Scottish or Welsh elections. The former First Minister of Scotland, who's not in his place today, said it would be wrong to hold a referendum within 6 weeks of those elections, and I can guarantee that won't happen.
Mr. Angus Robertson.
Mr. Speaker, the First Ministers of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have written today saying that they believe holding a referendum in June, and I quote, risks confusing issues when clarity is required, and call on the Prime Minister to, again, I quote, defer the EU referendum at least until later in the year. Why will the Prime Minister not respect the electorates and the governments of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland and give that commitment today?
First of all, I do respect the former First Minister of Scotland who said that 6 weeks was what was necessary. I also respect the electorates of England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland on the basis that I think people are perfectly capable of making up their minds in a local election or in a Scottish parliamentary election or in a Welsh Assembly election, and then a period of some weeks afterwards making up their mind all over again on the vital question of the European Union. So no date has been fixed. There must be a 6-week gap, but I think, frankly, he's looking for things to complain about. This House has voted for a referendum. It'd be pretty odd if, having voted for a referendum, we then spend ages debating about not having one.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will be alarmed to hear that a shop in Gillingham selling illicit tobacco was making £25,000
excessive chuntering from a sedentary position from a number of Scottish National Party members who wanted an orderly hearing for their leader. The honourable gentleman is entitled to be heard. I appeal to the honourable gentleman to start his question again. Let's hear it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will be alarmed to hear that a shop in Gillingham selling illicit tobacco was making £25,000 a week, destroying the local economy, damaging people's health, and nationally, this trade is costing the economy £2 billion a year. Will the government look at increasing the statutory maximum penalty for this offence to bring it in line with the supply of Class C drugs?
Well, I'll certainly look at the issue my honourable friend raises. As far as I can see, HMRC, working very closely with Border Force, has been highly effective at reducing this tax gap of people selling illegal tobacco and have closed off about 1.3 billion of tax gap since the year 2000. They do have a wide range of sanctions to deal with illicit sales, including seizure, penalties and criminal prosecutions. They prosecuted almost 800 different people, I think, in the last 2 years. So I think the powers are there, but I'll have a check and see if more is needed.
Anne McLaughlin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent works for the DWP and he tells me that the government is correct when they deny that staff have targets set for sanctioning benefits. They're not called targets, they're called aspirations. Can I ask the Prime Minister, with the rollout of in-work benefit sanctions, how many of his own low-paid DWP colleagues should my constituent aspire to sanction this year?
What I'd say to the honourable lady is that sanctions in a benefit system are important. We want a benefit system that's there for people who can't find a job, who need support. But it shouldn't be a lifestyle choice, and if people can work, they should work. That's why we have a sanction system, and I believe that sanction system is fairly applied.
Mr. Christopher Chope.
Mr. Speaker, may I share my right honourable friend's disappointment that despite all his hard work, the European Union is forcing him to abandon our manifesto pledge to change the benefit system for migrants. And will my right honourable friend confirm that, sadly, the only way in which we're going to be able to regain control over our own borders is by leaving the European Union?
Well, I have great respect for my right honourable friend, but we don't agree on this one. We said in our manifesto that anyone coming to Britain from the EU searching for work should not get unemployment benefit, and we've fulfilled that promise. We've said if within 6 months they don't have a job, they should go home. We've fulfilled that promise. We said that people should not be able to come here and send British child benefit back to their families, and we have secured that they will only get child benefit at a local rate. And we said no more something for nothing. The idea that you could come here, claim immediately from our in-work benefit system without paying in was not right. And I said we would secure a 4-year gap, and we have. People said it would be impossible, but that is what we put in place. Now, it is a negotiation, but these are good proposals that I think will have the backing of the British people, because they mean no more something for nothing, and that's a vital value for Britain.
Ruth Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over 2,500 people are directly employed by the ceramics industry in Stoke-on-Trent North and Kidsgrove. These and tens of thousands of British manufacturing jobs are at risk if China is granted market economy status. It's my first question. The Prime Minister is very happy to sell off the family silver, but can he guarantee that he won't sell off the family crockery?
Well, we want to support industry in the potteries, and that is why we're helping manufacturing with R&D tax credits, we're helping with apprenticeship schemes, we're helping with a whole range of measures, not least the energy-intensive industry measures, which are very, very important for the constituency she represents. That's what we want to see. Now, the issue with market economy status is a separate issue. As I've said before, even if they get that status, they can't dump steel products or other things into European markets, and they can be fine. And what we should be doing is making sure we're driving open markets for us to sell to China. They are the ones with the massive growth in the middle class taking place, of hundreds of millions of people joining that, and there are many great products made in Stoke that should be sold in China.
Andrew Turner.
Sir, the Isle of Wight Council can balance the books this year, but fear they will be unable to do so next year. Would my right honourable friend confirm the government's willingness to work with them over the coming months to help them to access existing sources of finance or find new ways to address the island's unique circumstances?
Well, we're very happy to work with the authorities on the Isle of Wight. I think I'm right in saying that when it comes to spending power, actually the spending power is increasing slightly in the next year. But what we are doing with this settlement for local government is, because overall it's a relatively flat cash settlement over the 5-year period, we're allowing councils to use their reserves and also to sell unwanted property and use that money directly to provide services to bridge over the period of the next 5 years. So very happy to look at the circumstances of the Isle of Wight, but I believe this is a fair settlement.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has told us today that more money is going into the NHS. Let me tell him that my local hospital trust is spending £1.5 million a week on interest payments alone to Innisfree for its PFI deal. Now, wait for it. Come on. The Prime Minister eventually saw sense about the need to deal with the damage that high-cost credit was doing to individuals. When will he deal with these legal loan sharks of the public sector?
Well, you know, sometimes it takes a long time to unwind the damage done by a Labour government. She's absolutely right. One of the first things we did in government was to launch a review of Labour's PFI and begin an initiative to extract savings and give better value for money for all of the projects, including Bart's. What we're seeing in her own health economy is we're seeing there are more GPs in the NHS. And in terms of the NHS Waltham Forest Clinical Commissioning Group, next year they're getting a cash increase of 3.7%. That is money provided because we're putting more money into the NHS.
Antoinette Sandbach.
Mr. Speaker, a lone parent in my constituency has described her experience of the child maintenance group as appalling, with a lack of communication, being passed from pillar to post, a failure to act on evidence and not progressing with enforcement. Will the Prime Minister arrange for the Secretary of State to meet with my constituents to discuss the particular issues around the enforcement of child maintenance when non-resident parents are gaming the system and depriving children of the support they're entitled to?
I'm very happy to help arrange that meeting, and I know my honourable friend speaks, as many of us find in our own constituency surgeries, particularly about the behaviour of the non-resident parent and how they give everyone the runaround and don't fulfil their duties by helping to pay for the children that they are responsible for. As she knows, we introduced a new statutory child maintenance service for parents who are unable to make a family-based arrangement. It should be bringing speedier processing of applications, simpler calculations and faster enforcement action, but I'll make sure she has the meeting that she needs to straighten out this case.
Tom Elliott.
Mr. Speaker, I'm wondering if the Prime Minister can comment on recent events in Northern Ireland regarding the investigations into Steak Knife, the alleged informer, and will he ensure that there are equal investigations into the likes of the Enniskillen bomb, the T-Ban bomb, and other major atrocities by terrorist organisations?
Well, I will look carefully at what he says. We have to make sure that we look at all of these things in a fair and reasonable way, and perhaps I can write to him about the issue.
Julian Knight.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. £38 billion a year is currently spent on pensions tax relief, with 3/4 of that going to higher rate taxpayers who need it the least. Would the Prime Minister agree with me that it would be a huge boost to social justice in this country if pensions tax relief was reformed to a single flat rate, which would benefit millions of hard-working Britons?
Well, I know my honourable friend speaks on this issue with considerable expertise because of the career he had before coming to this House. So he brings a lot of knowledge about this sector. Look, he's right that there are great costs related to pension tax relief. That's why the Chancellor published a consultation last summer to see whether the system should be reformed. But as the saying goes, taxes are a matter for the Chancellor and his budget.
Margaret Greenwood.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome the government's announcement of further support for child refugees last week, as far as it goes. A 9-year-old girl who lives in my constituency has recently asked me what we're doing to help refugee children. Of course, what a child refugee needs most is a home. When are we going to offer a home to 3,000 unaccompanied refugee children in Europe?
Well, first of all, let me say to the Honourable Lady what we've done so far. She knows about, obviously, the 20,000 relocation scheme, where we got 1,000 people in by Christmas, including many vulnerable children. That is going well. I think fewer people are aware of the fact that in the last year, through our normal asylum processes, we took something like 2,500 unaccompanied children last year. And if you look at Kent Social Services and the pressure they're under, they've got something like 1,000 children that they are looking after and obviously facing great pressures on. I think another point that people don't always recognise is, of course, unaccompanied children in Europe, if they claim asylum in the country they're in, under the Dublin regulations, if they have direct family in Britain, they can come to Britain. So we think that is the right approach, taking some more people from the region, but being very cautious because all the evidence shows, even if it's an orphan child, they may well have some broader family they're connected to, and it's better to keep them with them.
Rutley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given the security threats faced by this country, whose policies are most dangerous? Those in Scotland who want to scrap our nuclear deterrent completely, or those on the party opposite who want to keep Trident submarines without nuclear missiles?
Well, it is hard to choose from the wrong or the bizarre. You can take your pick. Labour's latest plan is to use Trident submarines to transport military personnel around the world. It's the most expensive Uber service that anyone has ever thought of. You really do wonder, what on earth will they think of next?
Martin Doherty.
Prime Minister may be aware of the case of my constituent Lisa Brown, whose family were notified by Spanish police authorities on the 10th of November 2015 as a missing person, though could have been missing since the 6th of November. Lisa's mother, Catherine, her sister Helen and brother Craig have visited Spain several times since and have met both with Spanish authorities and with UK consular staff. While the Spanish authorities state they are actively working on this case, there have been various pieces of misinformation in the Spanish media which we know not to have been helpful. Can I call upon the Prime Minister to seek assurances on behalf of Lisa's family from the Spanish authorities here in London and in Madrid, as well as the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, that everything possible is being done to ensure that Lisa's family can get the answers they so desperately need?
I will certainly look into this case and make sure, after the Honourable Gentleman has raised it so clearly, that the Europe Minister meets with him to try and make sure everything is done for Lisa's family that's possible.
Spencer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Further to the question from the Honourable Lady from Walthamstow, my Shield Forest Hospital Trust is also wrestling with a disastrous PFI signed under the Labour government. Luckily, there's light at the end of the tunnel as Nottingham Derby Trust look to take over Shield Forest hospitals. But can the Prime Minister assist them in any way in solving this enormous mess left by the previous Labour government?
They are extremely difficult to solve, these PFI contracts, because, of course, they were entered into and signed. My understanding is that Monitor and the Care Quality Commission are absolutely clear that Sherwood needs a long-term partnership, and I understand, as he says, the Trust plans to announce its preferred partner in mid-February, and that hopefully will help it to support the services that we need, but I'll look carefully and make sure the Health Secretary looks carefully at the suggestion he makes.
Gwen Bradshaw.
Mr. Speaker, following the shocking official report into the murder here in London of Alexander Litvinenko, when will he and his Chancellor take some meaningful action to tackle the dirty Russian money and property here in London that helps sustain the Putin regime?
Well, first of all, the report was shocking. although, as the Home Secretary said at the time, this confirmed what the previous Labour government understood to have happened. But nonetheless, when you read the report all over again, it is deeply shocking what happened, and that is why we've taken action in terms of asset freezes and the other measures described by the Home Secretary. In terms of the problem of so-called hot money coming into London, I made a speech recently explaining that we are doing more than other countries in terms of transparency, in terms of beneficial ownership, who owns what in terms of companies, and we're also going to do the same in terms of property. And I think that is one of the best ways, not just to make sure we don't have illegal Russian money, but make sure that corrupt money stolen from African taxpayers and other continents doesn't end up in London.
Johnny Mercer.
Thank you. When I first came to this House, I spoke of that great stain upon this nation when it comes to our care of our armed forces veterans and doing our duty in this House by those who have done our bidding. Here's a sentence from an email on the weekend. I've not had any letter nor any warning. I was told after our Swede that was it and not to think about it anymore, but now I dread the post every day. The Prime Minister has already intervened to tighten up the historical allegations process, and for that I thank him. But will my right honourable friend pledge to look even more closely at the support we are giving, so that what we want to deliver and what is actually delivered are the same thing?
Well, I'm very happy to look at that specifically. On Al-Swedi, I've been very clear about what went wrong and how unacceptable it was, and let me repeat again, we'll continue to provide our fullest support to those going through investigations, including providing legal advice, and also we will crack down on any legal firm that we found has abused the system. Now, we do, because we have got the military covenant now written into law, and a covenant group that meets under the excellent chairmanship of my right honourable friend, the member for West Dorset, we have an opportunity not just to raise, but to try and properly tackle these issues in a systematic way.
Stephen Kinnock.
Mr. Speaker, the dumping of Chinese steel is crippling the British steel industry. The granting of market economy status to China would dramatically reduce scope for taking anti-dumping measures. Why then is the Prime Minister supporting market economy status for China? Is it because he puts cozying up to Beijing ahead of protecting British industry?
No, I put helping British industry first. That is why we've cut taxes for British industry. We're cutting the energy bills for British industry. We're helping with apprenticeships. We're busting open markets abroad so the British industries can succeed. And crucially for the steel industry, we're investing in our infrastructure and trying to make sure there's a real forward order book for British steel. But I think the honourable gentleman is wrong. We should take these two issues separately. If there is illegal dumping, then we will support action in the European Union. And that can be done in spite of the status that a country has. We've actually put those sorts of burdens on America before today. So I don't think it's right to connect the two issues in the way he does.
Finally, Mary Robinson.
Mental health issues take many forms, and services for those suffering from eating disorders are often overlooked. And yet they cause intolerable distress and suffering. As health devolution in Manchester gathers pace, does the Prime Minister agree with me that it is an important opportunity to secure better mental health service provision, particularly for children and young adults in Cheadle?
I think my honourable friend is absolutely right. I don't see any reason why the devolution of resources to Greater Manchester under this landmark deal will disadvantage mental health. I think, if anything, it will probably lead to even greater priority being given to mental health as people can see the connections between mental health and holding back opportunity for so many people. We are investing more in terms of children's mental health and giving a greater focus, particularly to eating disorders, where we do see, tragically, a real growth in this problem. So the money is there and the devolution should help.
Order. Statement. The Prime Minister.
Hear, hear. Speaker. With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to make a statement on progress with our renegotiation. The House has now had the chance to study the documents published by the European Council yesterday. I believe this is an important milestone in the process of reform, renegotiation and referendum that we set out in our manifesto and which this government is delivering. We've now legislated for that referendum and we are holding that renegotiation. So let me set out the problems that we are trying to fix and the progress that we have made. First, we don't want to have our country bound up in an ever closer political union in Europe. We are a proud and independent nation with proud, independent, democratic institutions that has served us well over the centuries. For us, Europe is about working together to advance our shared prosperity and our shared security. It's not about being sucked into some kind of European superstate, not now, not ever. Mr. Speaker, the draft text set out in full the special status according to the UK and clearly carves us out of further political integration. And they actually go further to make clear that EU countries don't even have to aim for a common destination. This is a formal recognition of the flexible Europe that Britain has long been arguing for. In keeping Britain out of ever closer union, I also wanted to strengthen the role of this House and all national parliaments. So we now have a proposal in the text that if Brussels comes up with legislation we don't want, we can get together with other parliaments and block it with a red card. And we've also proposed a new mechanism to finally enforce the principle of subsidiarity, a principle dear to this House, which states that as far as possible, powers should sit here in this Parliament, not in Brussels. So every year the European Union has got to go through the powers they exercise and work out which are no longer needed and should be returned to nation states. Now, second, I said we wanted to make Europe more competitive and deal with the rulemaking and the bureaucracy that can cost jobs here in Britain and indeed across the European Union. We asked for commitments on all the areas central to European competitiveness. We want international trade deals signed, the single market completed, and regulation stripped back. All of these things are covered in the draft texts. There is a new proposal for specific targets to reduce the burdens on business in key sectors. This will particularly help small and medium-sized businesses. And there is a new mechanism to drive these targets through and cut the level of red tape year on year. Third, we are absolutely clear that Britain is going to keep the pound, in my view, forever. But we need to be just as clear that we can keep the pound in a European Union that will be fair to our currency. Put simply, the EU must not become a euro-only club. If it does, it would not be a club for us. So we called for a series of principles to protect the single market for Britain. We said there must be no discrimination against the pound, no disadvantage for businesses that use our currency wherever they're located in the EU, and no option for Britain ever again to be forced to bail out Eurozone countries. All of these principles are reflected in the draft text, which is legally binding. And again, there is a mechanism. Britain has the ability to act to uphold these principles and protect our interests. Now, Mr. Speaker, we should be clear. British jobs depend on being able to trade on a level playing field within the European single market, whether in financial services or cars or anything else. So this plan, if agreed, will provide the strongest possible protection for Britain from discrimination and unfair rules and practices. For instance, never again could the EU try its so-called location policy, that the settling of complex trades in euros must only take place in Eurozone countries. These principles would outlaw that sort of proposal. Now, Mr. Speaker, these are protections we could not have if Britain were outside the European Union. Now, fourth, we want to deal with the pressures of immigration, which have become too great. Of course, we need to do more to control migration from outside the European Union. We are doing that, and we will be announcing more measures on that front. But we need to control migration from within the EU too. Now, the draft texts represent the strongest package we've ever had on tackling the abuse of free movement and closing down the backdoor routes to Britain. It includes greater freedoms for Britain to act against fraud and prevent those who pose a genuine and serious threat from coming to this country. It includes a new law to overturn a decision by the European Court, which has allowed thousands of illegal migrants to marry other EU nationals and acquire the right to stay in our country. And it has been a source of perpetual frustration that we can't impose our own immigration rules on third country nationals coming from the European Union. But now, after the hard work of the Home Secretary, we have a proposal to put that right. Mr. Speaker, there are also new proposals to reduce the pull factor that our benefit system exerts across Europe by allowing instant access to welfare from the day someone arrives. People said that Europe wouldn't even recognise that we had this problem. But the text explicitly recognises that welfare systems can act as an unnatural draw to come to this country. Now, Mr. Speaker, our manifesto set out 4 objectives to solve this problem. I mentioned these at Prime Minister's questions. We'd already delivered on 2 of them within months of the general election. Already, EU migrants will no longer be able to claim universal credit, the new unemployment benefit, while looking for work. And if those coming from the EU haven't found work within 6 months, they can now be required to leave. Now, in these texts, we've secured proposals for the other two areas. If someone comes from another country in Europe, leaving their family at home, they will have their child benefit paid at the local rate, not at the generous British rate. And crucially, we've made progress on reducing the draw of our generous in-work benefits. People said it would be impossible to end the idea of something for nothing, and that a 4-year restriction on benefits was completely out of the question. But that is now what is in the text. An emergency break that will mean people coming to Britain from within the EU will have to wait 4 years until they have full access to our benefits. And the European Commission has said very clearly that Britain qualifies already to use this mechanism. So with the necessary legislation, we'll be able to implement it shortly after the referendum. Finally, let me be absolutely clear about the legal status of these changes that are now on offer. People said we would never get something that was legally binding. But this plan, if agreed, will be exactly that. These changes will be binding in international law and will be deposited at the UN. They cannot be changed without the unanimous agreement of every EU country, and that includes Britain. So when I said I wanted change that is legally binding and irreversible, that is what I've got. And in key areas, treaty change is envisaged in these documents. So, Mr. Speaker, I believe we are making real progress in all 4 areas. But the process is far from over. There are details that still need to be pinned down and intense negotiations to try and agree the deal with 27 other countries. It will require hard work, determination and patience to see it through. But I do believe that with these draft texts and with all the work we've done with our European partners, Britain is getting closer to the decision point. It is, of course, right that this House should debate these issues in detail. So in addition to this statement, and of course a statement following a council later this month, the government will also make time for a full day's debate on the floor of this House. Mr. Speaker, as we approach this choice, let me be clear about 2 things. First, I am not arguing, and I will never argue, that Britain couldn't survive outside the European Union. We are the 5th largest economy in the world, the biggest defence player in Europe, with one of the most extensive and influential diplomatic networks on the planet. The question is not could Britain succeed outside the European Union, it is how will we be most successful? How will Britain be most prosperous? How will we create the most jobs? How will we have the most influence on the rules that shape the global economy and affect us? How will we be most secure? And I've always said that the best answers to those questions can be found within a reformed European Union. But let me say again, if we can't secure these changes, I rule nothing out. Now, second, even if we secure these changes, you will never hear me say that this organisation is now fixed. Far from it. There will be many things that remain to be reformed, and Britain would continue to lead the way. We would continue to make sure that Europe works for the countries of Europe, for the businesses of Europe, for the peoples of Europe, and crucially for the British people who want to work and have security and get on and make the most of their lives. So if we stay, Britain will be in there, keeping a lid on the budget, protecting our rebates, stripping away unnecessary regulation, and seeing through the commitments we've secured in this renegotiation, ensuring that Britain truly can have the best of both worlds, in the parts of Europe that work for us and out of those that don't, in the single market, free to travel around Europe, part of an organisation where cooperation on security and trade can make Britain and its partners safer and more prosperous, but with guarantees that we will never be part of the euro, never be part of Schengen, never be part of a European army, never be forced to bail out the eurozone with our taxpayers' money, and never be part of a European superstate. That is the prize on offer. A clear path that can lead to a fresh settlement for Britain in a reformed European Union. A settlement that will offer the best future for jobs, security and strength for our country. A settlement which, as our manifesto promised nearly a year ago, will offer families in our country security at every stage of their lives. That is what we're fighting for, and I commend this statement to the House. Jeremy Corbyn!
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the Prime Minister for sending me a copy of the statement 45 minutes ago, and an hour ago, I'm sorry, and I'm pleased that he's now decided to finally update the House. However, it is a bit unfortunate that despite his trumpeting of sovereignty of national parliaments in his EU negotiations, the Prime Minister didn't think to come and update our own Parliament first. I hope he had a good day in Chippenham yesterday, but I note that he spent a lot of time answering questions from journalists when it would surely have been more respectful to this House to come here first and answer questions from members. Because in truth, Mr. Speaker, his negotiation in reality is a Tory party drama that's being played out in front of us as we see at the moment. The Labour Party is committed to keeping Britain in the European Union because we believe it's the best. Don't get too excited. Let me tell you the rest of it. Because we believe it is in the best framework for European trade and cooperation in the 21st century and in the best interests of people in this country. But we believe the Prime Minister has been negotiating the wrong goals in the wrong way for the wrong reasons. For all the sound and fury, the Prime Minister has ended up exactly where he knew he would be, making the case to remain in Europe, which was what he always intended, despite renegotiated spectacle choreographed for TV cameras over the whole continent. Mr. Speaker, as his own backbenchers keep telling us, the proposals from the European Council are simply tinkering around the edges. They have little impact on what the EU delivers for workers in Britain or British businesses. We welcome the proposals for a majority of national parliaments to have a veto over Commission legislation. Even if it's heavily qualified, it seems the Prime Minister has finally moved towards the Labour Party's view on this issue, and we welcome him to that. Protecting non-Eurozone states is necessary, but we cannot let these proposals hamper efforts to regulate the financial sector, including bankers' bonuses. The crucial detail of the emergency brake on workers' benefits for EU migrants is entirely absent. When is that information going to be made available? But in any case, the Prime Minister calls the strongest package ever on the abuse of free movement doesn't actually begin to tackle the real problems around the impact of migration on jobs, wages and communities. Those demand action to support public services in areas of high population growth and regulation to prevent the subsidising of low pay and the grotesque exploitation of migrant workers by some very unscrupulous employers. It's the same with competitiveness. Is the Prime Minister really out to strengthen genuinely competitive markets, or is this proposal really a fig leaf for increasing pressure to privatise our public services, reduction of consumer standards, environmental protection or workers' rights? This is why Labour will continue to oppose the threats to services and rights from the TTIP negotiations. We need to reform to ensure all European governments have the right to intervene to protect publicly owned industries and services. This side of the House is delighted the Prime Minister has been forced to back down on his hopes to water down workers' rights. However, Mr. Speaker, we want to see workers' rights further protected and extended within the European Union. We need a strengthening of workers' rights in a really social Europe. And we want to see a democratic reform to make the European Union decision-making more accountable to its people. We must drive economic reform to put jobs and sustainable growth at the centre of European policy and work with partners in Europe to bring tax avoidance under control so that we can get a far better deal than the Chancellor managed with Google last week. But, Mr. Speaker, to keep and extend these employment protections, we have to remain within the European Union or leave the field to the Conservative Party to make a bonfire of workers' rights. The Prime Minister says he's secured Britain's exclusion from Schengen, a European army and a European superstate. The Prime Minister is living in a never-never land. We have never argued for those things and don't intend to. We need to work with our allies in Europe to achieve the more progressive reforms its people need, to build a more democratic Europe that delivers jobs, prosperity and security for all of its people. We must do this together. That's why when the referendum is finally held, we'll be campaigning to remain a member. But I end by asking the question to the Prime Minister, does does he now agree that once this smoke and mirrors sideshow deal is finally done, we'll get on with it, end the uncertainty, and the referendum will indeed be held on June the 23rd, 2016?
Prime Minister.
Well, can I thank the right honourable gentleman for his questions? I mean, first of all, on the issue of making a statement today rather than yesterday, I felt yesterday I was in possession of all the documents, but I didn't think every member of this House would be, so I thought better to give honourable members a day to read the documents and have the debate today. It gave me the added advantage of being able to visit Chippenham, which of course is the town of the right honourable gentleman's birth, and I was able therefore to thank them for putting him on earth and for delivering him safely to this place. Now, in terms of the questions, first of all, he criticises the issues we put on the table: getting out of ever closer union, waiting times for welfare, guarantees for fairness between ins and outs. I know he didn't read the Labour manifesto, but I did. And actually all of those things were in the Labour manifesto. Labour actually wanted a 2-year welfare wait rather than a 4-year welfare wait, but the other elements of our negotiation, many of them were supported by Labour, and so honourable members opposite can feel they have a mandate for backing these measures. He asked about the detail on the emergency migration break, because there are gaps in the text. He's absolutely right about that. We need to secure the best possible outcome at the February Council. He asked about the danger of exploitation of migrant workers. This is an area where I think he and I agree. That's why we've boosted the Gang Masters Licensing Authority. We put in place better coordination between them and the National Crime Agency. We're actually making sure there are more investigations and more prosecutions. Now, on TTIP, this is an area where we do profoundly disagree, and other socialist governments in Europe take my view, which is TTIP will actually be good for jobs, good for growth, good for businesses. And I'm not sure I ought to advise him to spend more time with trade unions, but actually if he spends time with trade unions in Sweden and some other countries in Northern Europe, he may find they too support TTIP because they want jobs for their members. Look, in the end, what I would say to the right honourable gentleman and to all members across this House, this is an important moment for our country. So yes, there'll be areas of disagreement between Conservative and Labour, but we're involved in trying to get the very best negotiation for Britain. And the European Parliament plays a part in that. The Party of European Socialists plays a part in that. So I would urge all honourable members, if you want to have no more something for nothing, if you want to get Britain out of ever closer union, if you want fairness between those in the euro and those out of the euro, and you want a more competitive and successful Europe, let's fight this together.
Yeah. Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Are you persuaded, Ken?
Feelings obviously getting roused on this subject. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has actually achieved more on the big issues in this negotiation than I ever expected, and I suspect more than hardline Eurosceptics ever expected, which is why they're denouncing it so fiercely. But as he says, he still has to deliver it. Now, does he accept that he's going to have great difficulty persuading governments in Central and Eastern Europe in particular to accept that their citizens, lawfully working here alongside English people in key sectors like the health service and the construction industry, should have lower take-home pay in the first few years than their English workmates? And so if he has to offer something in exchange for that, could he perhaps consider underlining our NATO commitment to those countries as their biggest concern is future military adventures by Putin's Russia, and to underline our role as one of, if not the, leading military contributor through NATO to the European alliance would be a very good offer to make by deploying more troops, perhaps, in order to get what is a difficult concession for our partners to make in those countries.
Prime Minister.
To my right honourable friend, and he has huge experience of European negotiations, both treaty negotiations and also ongoing negotiations in the Council of Ministers. So I'm very grateful for what he says. Look, he's absolutely right that these are difficult issues. My argument is that while we have the free movement of people that many British people take advantage of, we don't have harmonised welfare and benefit systems, and nor should we. And the second point I make to my colleagues in Europe is when countries in Europe have problems that they believe affect their key national interests, we've got to be flexible enough to deal with them. And I think that's what this agreement is showing. The advantage, of course, of the proposals put forward is that they will have the support of the European Commission, and I think that will reassure some of the states in Europe who have misgivings. He's absolutely right that we can also reassure them about our investment in their security, because I think that is a very important issue with Putin, as it were, to our east, with ISIL to our south. This is a moment where we need to make sure we're working together.
Mr. Angus Robertson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We in the Scottish National Party warmly welcome the opportunity to make the positive case for the European Union. It really matters that we are part of the world's largest single market. It really matters that we can help determine the rules and laws and apply to us. And it really matters that we have a social Europe with rights and protections for citizens and for workers. So will the Prime Minister first off commit to a positive campaign to remain in the European Union and not resort to the negative tactics of Project Fear? On the Prime Minister's negotiations, can I suggest that he stops pretending having won some major victory? He's not even secured treaty change he promised, and much else besides. What is at stake is much, much bigger than his recent discussions. It is about whether we are in the EU or not, and that is what the debate across the UK will be in the run-up to the referendum. The timing of the referendum really matters to the electorates and to the governments of Scotland, of Wales and Northern Ireland, as well as London, where there are elections in May. And this morning, Mr. Speaker, the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, the Labour First Minister of Wales, Carwyn Jones, the First Minister of Northern Ireland, Arlene Foster. I think the First Ministers of Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland deserve a little bit more respect than the baying from the Tory side. The First Minister of Northern Ireland, Arlene Foster, and the Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland, Martin McGuinness, have written to the Prime Minister today. They say the following, and I think that honourable and right honourable members should listen to what they say. We believe that holding a referendum as early as June will mean that a significant part of the referendum campaign will necessarily run in parallel with those elections and risks confusing issues at a moment when clarity is required. We believe that the European referendum is of vital importance to the future of the whole United Kingdom, and the debate leading up to it should therefore be free of other campaigning distraction. We believe it would be better for you, for the Prime Minister, to commit to deferring the EU referendum at least until later in the year. So will the Prime Minister take the opportunity and confirm that he will be respectful of the views of the governments of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland and defer the referendum beyond June? And finally, Mr. Speaker, may I take the opportunity yet again to ask the Prime Minister to answer this question, which he has singly failed to do so thus far. Will he confirm that there are still no safeguards in place which would stop Scotland being taken out of the EU against the will of the Scottish electorate?
First of all, let me say, yes, of course, I think that when this campaign comes, and of course we need first an agreement and recommended position by the British government and all the rest of it, but when this campaign comes, yes, of course, it should be a positive campaign. In terms of what he says about treaty change and whether this is legally binding, as I explained, it is legally binding and it does envisage treaty change. In terms of timing, as I explained at Prime Minister's questions, it is a matter for the House. The House debated it. The House ruled out, coinciding with the Scottish, Welsh and London elections. But the House did not rule out holding a referendum at another time, and specifically the former First Minister said that 6 weeks was the appropriate gap. Look, obviously we have to wait to see whether an agreement is reached, but where I disagree with him is I don't believe that somehow this is confusing issues. I think people are perfectly capable, 6 or more weeks after one set of elections, to consider another election. And I note that the leader of the opposition, whose party is in control of Wales, was actually pressing me to hold the referendum on the 23rd of June. So there's obviously a range of opinions out there. I think the best thing to do is get the deal done and then hold a referendum.
Sir William Cash.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is all about voters' trust. Why has my right honourable friend, in order to stay in, bypassed so many promises and principles? Our national parliament, he said at Bloomberg, is the root of our democracy, not a majority of red cards in other parliaments. That we would have full-on treaty change, not the arrangements that we now have had announced to us today. We were promised a fundamental change in our relationship with the EU. We were promised that we would deal with the excessive immigrant numbers, which has now been whittled down to an issue about in-work benefits controlled by the European Court of Justice. Above all, this entire package, Mr. Speaker, we were told and promised would be both legally binding and also irreversible. But now it will be stitched up by a political decision by the European Council and not by a guaranteed treaty change at the right time. And this, I have to say to the Prime Minister, is a wholly inappropriate way of dealing with this matter.
Great respect for my honourable friend, but I have to say, on this issue of whether it is legally binding, I really do believe he's wrong. If this document is agreed, it would be an international law decision, and as an international law decision, the European Court of Justice have to take it into account. And I would make the point to him, because he follows these things very closely, Denmark negotiated the same sort of legal opt-outs, and 23 years on, they clearly stand and are legally binding. Those are the facts. Now, he asks whether we are meeting what we set out in terms of the promises we made. We made very clear promises in our manifesto. Get Britain out of ever closer union. That is a promise that we kept. Make sure we restrict immigrants' welfare benefits. That is a promise that we're keeping. Real fairness between euro-ins and euro-outs. That is a promise that we're keeping. So in every area, more competitiveness, making sure subsidiarity means something. We've met the promises that we've set out. Now, I understand there will be those who say we didn't ask for enough or we need more reform. I believe these are the reforms that go to the heart of the concerns of the British people, people who feel this organisation is too much of a political union, it's too bureaucratic, it's not fair for non-Euro countries, and we want more control of immigration. Those 4 things are largely delivered through this negotiation. I would just ask, also, colleagues on all sides of the House, I've sat on benches this side, that side. I've heard about the Maastricht Treaty, about the Lisbon Treaty, about the Nice Treaty, about the Amsterdam Treaty, but I've never seen a Prime Minister standing at this dispatch box with a unilaterally achieved declaration of bringing powers back to our country. That's what we've got. That's what's within our grasp.
Mr. Alan Johnson.
Will the Prime Minister join me in welcoming the launch of Environmentalists for Europe today, co-chaired by Stanley Johnson, the father of the Right Honourable Member for Uxbridge and South Ruislip? Will he also welcome the splendid article last week setting out the importance for science and technology of remaining in the European Union, penned by his Science Minister, the brother of the Right Honourable Member for Uxbridge and South Ruislip? Will he have a word with his Right Honourable friend and tell him the importance of family solidarity and joining the swelling ranks of Johnsons for Europe?
Very good. We can't have too many Johnsons agreeing with each other. He's absolutely right. There's also Rachel Johnson, the columnist. We'll have to go after her and make sure... look, I think he makes a very important point about universities and grants, because we all complain. We all complain rightly about the European budget, and that's why it's so important we've got it under control and it has to fall every year. But we did safeguard in those budget negotiations the money that British universities actually benefit from on a disproportionate basis. But as for completing the happy family pack of the Johnsons, we may have to wait a bit longer.
Well, I would call the honourable gentleman to ask a question if he were standing, but he isn't, so I won't. You can't have it all. John Redwood.
As we are driven in the EU vehicle towards ever closer union and to political union, how does it help to try and fit a couple of emergency brakes that lie within the control of the EU and not us? Isn't the only way to get control of our borders, our tax revenues and our welfare system to leave and be a good European and let them get on with their political union?
Prime Minister.
Yes. Well, I don't agree with that, because I think actually what we're doing here is making sure that it's very clear Britain is carved out of ever closer union, and I think that is a real advance. Indeed, it's something that he and other colleagues have been asking for, quite rightly, and I've always believed is right, because our view about Europe is that we're not there for political union. We're there for cooperation, we're there for trade, we're there for working together on the things that matter. And look, of course, these documents can change. This is all in draft, but one of the issues on ever closer union is that actually the European Union has gone further than I thought they would, and has said this, which I think colleagues would find interesting. The references to an ever closer union do not offer a basis for extending the scope of any provision of the treaties or of EU secondary legislation. They should not be used either to support an extensive interpretation of the competences of the Union or the power of its institutions as set out in the treaty. Now, that's never been said before in those ways. And those of us who care about ever closer union and getting out of ever closer union, this actually goes a long way to achieving, in many ways, more than what we asked for.
Isla Stewart.
The European continent has seen flows of people and immigration and refugees larger since the end of World War II. The Balkans are becoming ever more volatile, and our NATO partner Turkey is not behaving in a way which has been as helpful as it could have been. Have any of the negotiations the Prime Minister has been involved in actually increased the security of the European continent or the security of the United Kingdom?
Minister.
I would argue both. When it comes to the security of the continent, we recognise that Europe's external border, although it's not our external border because we're not in Schengen, it does matter. And that is why we've actually sent more representatives to go and help with the Asylum and Immigration Support Office than any other country. And why we're happy to do even more, working with the Greeks, indeed working with the Turks. But there's an important change in all of this, which does increase the security of Britain going forward. Now, look, first of all, because we're not in Schengen, foreign nationals coming to other European countries, we don't have to let them into Britain. Long may that be the case. But the key changes that the Home Secretary and I have managed to secure about protecting our immigration system from fraudsters, from sham marriages, from criminals, from people who get married to foreign European nationals to try and get into our country, frankly, they've become even more important. And the fact is we're going to secure those, if this goes ahead, from within the EU.
Mr. Boris Johnson.
Since you've been so kind as to call me, perhaps I could ask the Prime Minister how these changes as a result of this negotiation will restrict the volume of legislation coming from Brussels, will change the treaties so as to assert the sovereignty of this House of Commons and of these Houses of Parliament.
Well, let me take those issues in turn, because I think he's absolutely right to raise them. First of all, in terms of asserting the sovereignty of this House, that is something we did in 2010 through our European Referendum Act, but something I'm keen to do even more on, to put beyond doubt that this House of Commons is sovereign, and that is something we will look to do at the same time as concluding these negotiations. In terms of what are we doing to restrict the flow of legislation from Brussels, for the first time ever in here is a commitment not only that Europe has to examine all its competencies every year and work out what should be returned to nation states, subsidiarity in action rather than in words, but there's also the proposal to cut Brussels regulation with these bureaucracy cut targets. That's never been there before. So I would argue, if you look across this, you can see you've got welfare powers coming back, you've got immigration powers coming back that I've just spoken about, you've got bailout powers coming back, and of course the massive return of power we achieved in the last Parliament, the Justice and Home Affairs opt-out, the biggest return of power from Brussels to Britain since we joined the EU. We've absolutely nailed that down in these discussions to make sure they can't get round it. Now, these were all key objectives. I'm not saying this is perfect. I'm not saying the European Union will be perfect after this deal. It certainly won't. But will the British position be better and stronger? Yes, it will.
Mr. Nigel Dodds. Mr. Speaker, since assuming office in 2010, the Prime Minister has, on occasions, tried, to his credit, to limit the increases in the contributions by the United Kingdom to the European Union budget, varying degrees of success on that front. But can he now tell us, as a result of this agreement, given that the UK pays £9 billion and more net into the EU every single year, will he tell us how much our contribution is going to go down in net terms each year as a result of this agreement?
Well, we've already done the European budget agreement, which was for the first time, when you look at the 7-year financial perspective, that's the budget over the next 7 years, that is going to be lower over this 7 years than the last 7 years. So that actually makes there's a real terms cut, something no one thought would be possible to achieve. Now, the exact amount of money we give does depend sometimes on the growth and success of our economy. And one of the consequences of our strong growth and the difficult times in the Eurozone is that's meant a little bit more has been contributed. But the overall financial perspective is coming down, and that is good news for Britain.
Mr. Dominic Grieve.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend has achieved, I believe, quite remarkable a result because of the legally binding nature of the document which he brings back if it is accepted by the European Council. And in that context, he will know that one of the principal problems that's bedevilled the United Kingdom's relationship with the European Union has been the capricious interpretation of the treaties, sometimes to circumvent what the United Kingdom has believed to be its true treaty obligations. In view of the remarkable specificity of this document, does he agree with me that this will be a very powerful tool in preventing that happening in future?
I think my right honourable friend makes a very important point, because if we stand back for a moment and ask ourselves, how is it that powers have been taken from this House to Brussels, it's really happened in two ways. One, you've had a successive range of treaties passing competencies from Britain to Brussels. Now, that can't happen anymore because we legislated in the last Parliament for the referendum lock. So if any Prime Minister, me or any subsequent Prime Minister, tried to sign up to another treaty to pass powers, they couldn't. There'd be a referendum. The second way that powers get passed is through the judgment of the European Court of Justice. And that's why what's been secured on ever closer union is important, because it's saying there, in terms, if we can get this agreed, you can't use that clause to drive a ratchet of competencies going from Britain to Brussels. So the two routes for further integration where Britain is concerned, I think, have been effectively blocked off.
Liz Kendall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Prime Minister confirm that nothing in this renegotiation waters down important security cooperation at the EU level, like intelligence sharing, joint investigations and the EU arrest warrant, and that when a deal is done, finally, that he will join members on this side of the House making a strong case that our membership of the EU helps bring criminals to justice and keep Britain safe?
No, well, I want this deal to be done, and I think the security argument is an important one. I think there was, when my honourable friend, the Europe Minister, was answering questions yesterday, the point was made, is it consistent to say, as we do secure in this document, that national security is a national competence? Is it consistent to say that, but also to argue that Europe is important for security? I believe it is. It's very important that we're clear that when it comes to our policing, when it comes to our intelligence services, when it comes to those core competencies, they are for this House. They're for government decisions. But of course, there are ways we can cooperate in Europe to make ourselves safer, making sure we know when criminals are crossing borders, making sure we exchange passenger name records and the rest to keep us safe, which is why when we opted out of the Justice and Home Affairs area, repatriating about 100 powers to Britain, we stayed in the ones that really matter for keeping us safe. And so I think that's very important in demonstrating we're both maintaining national security as a national competence, but working with our partners to keep our people safe.
Dr. Liam Fox.
Can I first say through you to the Leader of the Opposition that I prefer what he describes as the drama of the Conservative Party to the tragedy of his Labour Party any day. Mr. Speaker, whether or not an emergency brake kicks in is ultimately the decision of the European Union, not the UK. The level of immigration at which it kicks in is ultimately a decision for the European Union, not the UK. Even ultimately the level of benefits sent abroad is a decision for the EU, not the UK. Is it not clear that we are not sovereign in these areas? We do not have independent control over these areas of policy, and isn't ultimately the decision in the referendum on areas of our own laws and our own borders, whether we want them to be determined here by ourselves or overseas by someone else?
Minister. Well, great respect for my right honourable friend, and I thought he explained very clearly on the radio this morning that he would be for leaving the EU, even without the renegotiation. He was very honest and frank about this. In terms of dramas and tragedies, I'm sure he'll join me in echoing the old insurance advert that we shouldn't turn a drama into a crisis. I think that would be the right approach. But what I'd say to him about the emergency brake is that the European Commission have been absolutely clear, and it says in the documents they consider the kind of information provided to it by the United Kingdom shows the type of exceptional situation that the proposed safeguard mechanism is intended to cover exists in the United Kingdom today. Yeah. So, of course, I'm all for maximising the sovereignty of this House, of our government, of the ability to do things. But we have said we want no more something for nothing. We want a welfare break. We want to be able to deny benefits to people in full before they've been here for 4 years. And this says that that can happen as soon as the legislation allows.
Dr. Alistair MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Could I reassure the Prime Minister that in my estimation most of us in Northern Ireland agree with him that we would be much more successful in the European Union than out? Yeah, yeah. And could we urge that the referendum be held later than June so that all aspects could be fully discussed and debated? But could I ask him, if and when all the negotiations are completed and that there's a positive stay-in result to the referendum, can he see the UK taking a much more positive and engaged role within the structures and organs of the European Union?
Prime Minister.
Well, what I'd say to the honourable gentleman is, were there to be agreement in February, I don't actually think a 4-month period before a referendum would be too short. I think 4 months is a good amount of time to be able to get across the key arguments and the facts and figures, and for both sides to be able to make their points. And I think that'll be equally important in Northern Ireland, and I absolutely give him the guarantee that if there is to be an agreement, I will make sure I personally spend time in Northern Ireland making the points that I think are most important. As for the role of the EU in helping to bring about the successful transformation of Northern Ireland, I think there have been some very positive moves in terms of grants and structural and other funds to help build the sort of strong economy in Northern Ireland that we need.
Mr. Peter Lilly.
As a former Secretary of State for Social Security, could I ask my right honourable friend to clarify the status of the agreement on migrants' benefits? The EU has no competence over benefits rules in member states, unless they conflict with the freedom of movement clause in the treaty. So if the proposed changes do not conflict with the treaty, we could have introduced them immediately without using up our negotiating clout on this issue. But if the changes do not conflict with the treaty, they'll be struck down by the EU court unless the treaty is changed first.
What I'd say to my honourable friend is that the view is that this emergency brake can be brought in under the existing treaties, but only with legislation through the European Parliament on an accelerated timetable. The leader of one of the major parties said it could take, 1, 2 or 3 months. So that is what makes it clear that you could act in this way legally and crucially, in my view, and I think in the view of the British public, not just legally, but quickly.
Kate Hoey.
Will the Prime Minister, when he meets the various leaders of the EU over the next few months, make it quite clear to them that the result of this referendum is to be decided by the British people and that they should not be trying to interfere in any way in the British people's views? Would he particularly say to the Irish Taoiseach that it was not at all helpful and in fact very, very uncomplimentary to the people of Northern Ireland, that he implied that if the British people, the United Kingdom, decided to leave the European Union, that it would threaten the peace process?
I absolutely agree with the Honourable Lady that this is a decision for the British people and the British people alone. I think that they certainly don't want to hear lectures from other people about that. I think, look, because this does affect Britain's relations with the rest of the world and other issues, that there may well be people who want to make a positive contribution, and that's a matter for them. The only thing I'd say about the Taoiseach, I think the peace process is secure and we must keep going on it. The only thing I would say is that I do believe he is a friend of the United Kingdom. He spoke up very strongly for Britain at the European Council, and I think was quite influential in trying to build goodwill and saying we should all in the European Union recognise that if a country has a national interest that is at stake and needs things fixed, we've got to be a flexible enough organisation, because otherwise we won't be able to sort these things out.
Davis. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has said that if we vote to leave the EU, he wants to continue as Prime Minister, a combination that I would fully support. And he certainly fancies himself as a negotiator. And so, given that we have a net contribution each year to the EU of £19 billion, given that we have a trade deficit with the European Union of £62 billion, and if we were to leave, we will be the single biggest export market of the European Union, does he think he has the ability to negotiate a free trade agreement from outside of the EU without handing over £19 billion a year every year?
Prime Minister. I have great respect for my honourable friend, who I think wanted to leave the EU, whatever came out of these negotiations. I'm sure he'll make his arguments very powerfully. Look, I think obviously you have to look at all of the issues, and I think once this debate starts, people want to look at all the alternatives. Would Britain be better off in a customs union arrangement like Turkey? Would we be better off in a free trade agreement like Canada? Would we be better off in a situation like Norway and Iceland? Now, I've started talking about some of those. I think the Norway example, for example, is not a strong example, because they actually contribute more per head to the EU than we do, and they have to just take all of the legislation passed in Brussels. But I'm sure this will be an important part of the debate to come.
Mr. David Winnick.
Hi, Mr. Prime Minister. But so far, at least in the exchanges, he doesn't seem to have persuaded any of the critics on his side over the virtues of his negotiations. He may have persuaded the Home Secretary for reasons we understand, but apparently none of the other critics.
Well, Prime Minister, question.
Maybe he can help me out. I don't know. Look, this is a very important issue for our country, but in the end, it's not going to be decided in this chamber. All of us are going to have to reach our own conclusions, and the only thing I would say to honourable members is, if you passionately believe in your heart that Britain is better off outside the EU, then you should vote that way. If you think, even if it's on balance, I think Britain's better off in, go with what you think. Don't do it. Don't take a view because of what your constituency association might say, or you're worried about a boundary review, or you think it might be advantageous this way or that way. Do what's in your heart. If you think it's right for Britain, then do that.
Sir Edward Lee.
Since no one else has done it so far after nearly an hour, and as my mum always said I should say thank you, may I thank the Prime Minister for giving us a choice in the first place. And is not one of the questions that will be asked in this referendum is, what is the point of having an emergency brake on your car if the backseat driver, namely the European Commission, has the power to tell you when and for how long you should put your foot on the brake pedal?
Well, this is rather a different situation, where they're telling us in advance that because of the pressures we face, this is a brake that we can use, and a brake that we can use relatively rapidly after a referendum. And I think it would make a difference. I mean, the facts are these, that 40% of EU migrants coming to Britain are accessing the the in-work benefit system. The average payment per family is £6,000, and don't tell me £6,000 isn't a quite major financial inducement. I think it's over 10,000 people are getting over £10,000 a year. You know, our benefit system, because you get instant access to it, is an unnatural pull and draw to our country, and so one of the things we should do to fix immigration into our country is change it, and that's what we're going to agree.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will he acknowledge that the referendum will be won or lost on bigger issues than this renegotiation, not least on a judgment that the greatest challenges facing us are better solved when countries work together? And so in that vein, can I invite him again to join me in welcoming the establishment of Environmentalists for Europe, which recognises that cross-border problems require cross-border solutions and also highlights the crucial role the EU plays in protecting our wildlife and nature in this country.
Prime Minister.
I think where you have genuine cross-border problems, you need to work across borders to try and make sure you have a strong solution. And I think the key issues are prosperity and security, but within security comes environmental security, and Britain at the Paris Accords was able to play a strong role because through our example of getting carbon emissions down and having a strong plan for the future, we encouraged other countries in Europe to do the same thing. That leveraged, terrible jargon, that brought about a better deal from the rest of the world.
Sir Eric Pickles.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Much has been said about the Conservative Party manifesto that he and the rest of these benches fought on. I have an electronic copy of that in front of me now. And should the Prime Minister succeed in his negotiations, he will have achieved not only the letter of what we promised, but also the spirit. And perhaps most important of all, he will give the British people a chance to vote for a reformed Europe or to vote for the uncertainty of leaving.
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. I mean, I do think that we're delivering the manifesto in fact and in spirit, not least by doing something many people thought we'd never actually deliver on, which is to hold that referendum. You know, I remember sitting over there when Tony Blair stood here and said, let battle commence, let the referendum begin over the constitutional treaty. And the fact that referendum was never held, I think in many ways poisoned a lot of the debate in Britain. That's why the manifesto is so clear about the referendum and about the renegotiation aims. Now, some people will say a better approach is to go in, kick over the table, walk out the door and say, I'm not going to come back in unless you give me a list of impossible demands. That was never the plan that we set out. The plan we set out was to address specifically the biggest concerns of the British people about competitiveness, about an ever closer union, about fairness and about migration. And that's what this negotiation, if we can complete it, that's what I believe it will do.
Caroline Flint.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I congratulate the Prime Minister on the progress he's made in tackling what I think voters for all parties see as unfairness in the freedom of movement, not to work, but freedom of movement in some cases to claim benefits here in the UK. But could I ask the Prime Minister, if we left the European Union, would this put at risk our cooperation with the French authorities in Calais to protect UK borders?
Prime Minister.
I think I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for what she says. I think she raises an important point about Calais. There's no doubt in my mind that that agreement that we have is incredibly beneficial. It works well, I think, for both countries. But for Britain, you know, being able to have our border controls in France and make sure we deal with people there, that is something I think that we should be very proud of and do everything we can to sustain. And it is part of the European cooperation that we have.
Mr. Michael Fabricant.
Thank you. Given the difficulty of getting any change to our EU membership approved by the other 27 countries, what we've got is as good as anyone, I think, might have expected and more. And I congratulate the Prime Minister on his achievement. But will my right honourable friend confirm that once the European Council has made its decision, he will respect the views of those ministers who might publicly express the opinion that the United Kingdom should now leave the EU, and that the careers of those ministers in this government won't be jeopardised or threatened as a consequence?
I can certainly give my honourable friend that assurance. We're still in the process of negotiation, and the manifesto we all stood on said that we wanted to get the best possible deal for Britain, and we would all work on that together, and that's exactly what we're doing. Once that deal, if that deal is agreed, whether it's February or perhaps later if it takes more time, then there'll be a meeting of the Cabinet to decide whether we can take a recommended position to the British people. And if that position is to recommend we stay in a reformed European Union, then yes, at that point, ministers who, as I've said, have long-standing views and want to campaign in another direction are able to do that. The government will still have a position. This is not a free-for-all. It will be a clear government position from which ministers can depart. And yes, as I've said, they shouldn't suffer disadvantage because they want to take that view.
Tasmina Ahmed Sheikh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has now listened to the views of the EU President and the other 27 heads of state in the European Union about his proposals. In the spirit of his very own One Nation Respect agenda, will he also now listen to the views of the heads of government in the devolved parliaments of the United Kingdom, who are unilateral in their belief that his preferred referendum timetable in scheduling a vote for the end of June is disrespectful and wrong?
Well, in terms of the Respect agenda, my Right Honourable friend, the Europe Minister, has had a number of conversations with the heads of the devolved administrations, and I think that's absolutely right. I think in terms of the referendum date, I don't think we should get ahead of ourselves. We need an agreement first, but I really don't believe that a 4-month period, a good 6 weeks or more between one set of elections and another set of elections, I don't believe in any way that is disrespectful. I have great respect for the electorates of our countries, that they're able to separate these issues and make a decision.
Sir Gerald Howarth.
Speaker, I commend my right honourable friend for sticking to his commitment to offer the British people a choice on this matter. I also support very much what he just said about maximising the sovereignty of this Parliament. Would he not agree that the proposal to require the United Kingdom to secure the support of many continental parliaments to block any EU directive which this Parliament opposes does not constitute the fundamental reform that he seeks?
Well, what I would argue is the red card proposal for national parliaments, that is something new, something that didn't previously exist. Now, of course, it will take a lot of coordination between parliaments, but where I think it's so much more powerful than the previous proposals of yellow cards and what have you, is that this would be an absolute block. If you could get the right number of parliaments together over an issue, the Council and the Commission wouldn't go ahead with it. So I think it goes alongside the subsidiarity test that takes place every year, getting Britain out of ever closer union, reaffirming the sovereignty of Parliament as we've done and will do again. It is one more measure that demonstrates we believe in national parliaments.
Pat McFadden.
There is a much broader case for continued UK membership of the EU beyond the 4 items in the Prime Minister's negotiation, based on jobs, our economic interest, our collective security and our place in the world. Does the Prime Minister accept that if we voted to leave the European Union, but then found ourselves still having to accept all the rules of the single market, that would be to swap our position as a rule maker for that of being a rule taker? That is not control, and it is not the right future for a great country.
No, as ever, the right honourable member speaks very, very clearly and powerfully. Of course he's right. There are much bigger arguments that are going to take place over the coming months, but I'm not over-claiming about the 4 areas where we've made progress. I merely say that they relate to 4 of the things that most concern the British people about Europe, and we're some way down the road of fixing them. I think the point he makes about being a rule maker, not a rule taker, is absolutely vital. Because, Britain is a major industrial economy, the huge car industry, a huge aerospace industry, a very important financial services industry, and we need to make sure we're around the table making the rules, because otherwise there's a danger you're not just a rule taker, but the rules are made against you, and that's what we need to avoid.
Sir Nicholas Soame.
Mr. Speaker, amongst the other important measures successfully negotiated by my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, I welcome in particular the recognition of the Union need to become more competitive to exploit the untapped potential of the single market and indeed to press on with vital trade negotiations with the United States and other key partners. But will the right honourable gentleman confirm, my right honourable friend confirm, that when these negotiations are, I hope, happily concluded, our national debate must move on to the real questions of this referendum relating to the safety, the economic security and the prosperity of the United Kingdom,
and the role we are to play in the world over the decades to come.
Prime Minister.
I think my right honourable friend is absolutely right, and we're going to be holding this debate at a time of great uncertainty and insecurity in our world. We have Russia with its destabilisation of Ukraine to our east. We have the horrors of Daesh to our south. And this is a time when I think we need to be working closely with our neighbours and friends to make sure we can deliver greater security for our people. Now, of course, it's true to say that the cornerstone of our security is NATO, is our Five Eyes partnership and our special relationship with the United States. These things are vital. But in the modern world, also border information, passenger name records, criminal records information systems, sharing information about terrorism, fighting together about against the Islamist extremism that we see not just in Syria and Iraq, but tragically in our own countries, all across the European Union. These are very important issues.
Ben Bradshaw.
Can I wish him and the British negotiating team well for what remains of this process? And will he acknowledge that all the major threats and challenges that Britain faces as a country, from international terrorism to climate change, demand that we work closely and collaboratively with our close neighbours and not relegate ourselves to a position of isolation and impotence?
Prime Minister.
My judgment in all of this is I want things that increase the power and the ability of Britain to fix problems, to deal with our own security, our own stability and our own prosperity. What matters is, are we more able to deal with these things? Now, one of the things Europe needs to get right is to get rid of the sort of pettifogging bureaucracy on the small things that infuriate people but don't actually make a difference, and focus instead on security and prosperity and jobs. That's the focus.
A very large number of honourable and right honourable members are still seeking to catch my eye. Legendarily, the Prime Minister on several occasions has been here for long periods to respond to questions, but there is now a premium on brevity which will be demonstrated, I'm sure, by the honourable gentleman for Harwich and North Essex. Mr Bernard Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I point out to my right honourable friend that the former Director General of the Legal Service of the Council of Ministers, Jean-Claude Piry, has said, and I quote, "There is no possibility to make a promise that would be legally binding to change the treaty later," unquote. And in fact, he then used a word which I might describe as male bovine excrement, Mr Speaker. Can the Prime Minister give a single example of where the European Court of Justice has ruled against the treaties in favour of an international agreement such as this one he is proposing?
Well, as I said to our right honourable friend, the member for Stone, Denmark negotiated the same sort of legal opt-outs, and 23 years on, they still stand and are legally binding.
Mary Cray.
Mr Speaker, on the 21st of July 2005, 2 weeks after 4 suicide bombers had murdered 52 people on London's transport network, Hussein Osman tried and failed to blow himself up on a Hammersmith and City tube line. He fled to Italy and he was speedily extradited to face justice in this country in a matter of weeks, rather than the years that a bilateral extradition process would have taken. Can the Prime Minister reassure me and honourable members on all sides of the House that nothing he does in the renegotiation process will put the functioning of the European arrest warrant at risk?
Prime Minister.
I can certainly give her that reassurance. The House debated this issue. As we opted out of much of Justice and Home Affairs, we specifically chose to opt back into the European arrest warrant because it has proved very valuable, not least in the case that she says and other cases, about making sure that terrorist suspects and serious criminals can be returned straight away to Britain. And obviously, if we stay in a reformed European Union, those arrangements continue. I think it's more a question for those who want to leave about how you try and put back in place something as powerful as what we have.
Steve Baker.
Mr Speaker, I very much admire the tenacity, the courage and the skill with which my right honourable friend is defending, nay, polishing this deal. But what happened to our 2010 manifesto commitments on the Charter of Fundamental Rights and social and employment law?
Well, we have put in place, as I've said, and as my honourable friend the former local government Secretary of State said, put in place all of the things that we put in our manifesto, the manifesto in which he and I stood at the last election. In terms of the social chapter no longer exists. It is now merely part of the single market legislation. But what we've secured for the first time is an annual reduction in terms of legislation to try and reduce the level of legislation, and that can, of course, include the sorts of legislation he's talking about.
Tom Brake.
Prime Minister, in the words of John Kenneth Galbraith, all great leaders have had one characteristic in common. It was the willingness to confront unequivocally the major anxiety of their people in their time. This and not much else is the essence of leadership. Prime Minister, once the EU negotiations are complete, will you confront people's anxiety, demonstrate strong leadership and unequivocally come out in favour of our EU membership?
I've been very clear. If we can achieve this negotiation, I will work very hard to convince people that Britain should stay in a reformed European Union. It will be very much in our national interest. Now, I'm not a great J.K. Galbraith expert, but I think when people have serious concerns, as people do in our country about the levels of immigration, it is right to try and act to address those concerns, and that's what part of this is about.
Sir Oliver Heald.
In welcoming the Prime Minister's very substantial progress towards an agreement which would allow us to stay in, does he agree with me that one of the most important aspects of it is that it's legally binding and that it gives a lot more clarity about Britain's role within the EU, both in terms of the new dispensation but also in relation to existing treaties? And therefore it is extremely powerful from a legal point of view and can only be revoked if we agree, and so it has that embedded force to it.
Well, we've now heard from the former Attorney General and the former Solicitor General, who have great legal expertise, and the point they make is right. This agreement would be legally binding on the Member States as a matter of international law. First, of course, it has to be agreed, but once agreed, he's absolutely right. It would be irreversible because it would only be amended or revoked if all the Member States, Britain included, decided to reverse it. And therein lies its irreversibility.
Mr. Stephen Timms.
Mr. Speaker, I want us to stay in the European Union, but the Prime Minister indicated that he would use the renegotiation to seek to address the unfairness in the European sugar market, which currently affects cane sugar refiners like Tate and Lyle in my constituency. And I wonder whether he's able to tell us if he's made any progress on that specific issue.
I think I will have to write to the Honourable Gentleman about that issue.
Mrs. Anne Main.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Commission might agree that we've at the moment meet the requirements to have a break, but that is his decision or their decision. They may not agree in a few years' time. Every step of these negotiations, unfortunately, still relies on somebody else giving us permission to make decisions for this country, like the thousands of harmonised directives that we struggle with day in, day out. Businesses have to ask permission of other countries. This is not what the British public wants, Prime Minister.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me deal with the harmonised directives. Because we've now got this test for subsidiarity, which were fine words in previous treaties but never had a mechanism to go with them, the European Council, the European Commission are going to have to look at all of these competences and return to Member States those that are no longer necessary. So that does seem to me important progress in the area that she says. On the issue of migration, the European Commission has said, as far as they're concerned, Britain qualifies now. Where she's absolutely right is we know that this is, as proposed, is the ability to stop someone getting full access to benefits for 4 years. We also, though, need to fill in the detail about how long such a mechanism lasts and how many times it can be renewed.
Hal Williams.
Mr. Speaker, in the Welsh general election, how will his Conservative colleagues argue for the economic stability that Wales so sorely needs when that might be overthrown by his referendum just 6 weeks later?
British people. Well,
Prime Minister.
British people, including people in Wales, voted for a government that would deliver economic stability but would also put this great question about Britain's future in front of the British people. And I think, as I've said before, if you look at the public opinion in Wales, England, Scotland and Northern Ireland, it is all, to a greater or lesser extent, in favour of holding a referendum. And so I think actually this is the right policy for the whole of the United Kingdom.
Mr. Christopher Chope.
Speaker, my right honourable friend has talked about what's going to happen with the European Court of Justice. does he recall that under the Lisbon Treaty there's a treaty requirement that the European Union should join the European Convention on Human Rights? That has not been implemented because the European Court of Justice has said that it is incompatible with the EU treaties. Doesn't this show that ultimately, although they may have to take something into account, they don't actually have to comply with it?
Well, I would say two things to my right honourable friend. First of all, I don't believe that the EU should join the European Convention on Human Rights. I don't think that's the right step forward. That's been the British government's position. And secondly, we are committed in our manifesto to change Britain's position with respect to the European Court of Human Rights by having our own British Bill of Rights, and we'll be coming forward with proposals for that shortly.
Rachel Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. British workers benefit from employment rights guaranteed at the EU level. So can the Prime Minister assure the House that his renegotiation doesn't affect important employment rights, including rights to paid leave, equal rights for part-time workers and fair pay for agency workers?
All of these rules are now no longer in a social chapter, but are part of single market legislation. We have the opportunity now to make sure that single market legislation is proportionate, that it is something that needs to be done at the European level rather than at the national level, and that is an ongoing conversation that there should be under the rules set out here.
Mr. Damien Green.
Does my right honourable friend agree that of all the documents issued yesterday, the most significant set of words are in Donald Tusk's letter to the members of the Council, where he says, in light of the United Kingdom's special situation under the treaties, it's not committed to further political integration? And isn't this precisely what the majority of the British people have always wanted, to revive an old phrase, to be in Europe but not run by Europe? And is that not what he's achieving?
Prime Minister.
I thought the letter was interesting in that regard, and the truth is that Britain's membership of this organisation is different to other countries' membership of this organisation because, as the document sets out, we're not in the euro, we're not participating in Schengen, we keep our own border controls, we choose whether to participate in measures of freedom, security and justice, we opted out of the Justice and Home Affairs area, and now we are opted out, as it were, of ever closer union. So our membership is different, and I think we need to make that case very strongly as we go forward.
Margaret Ritchie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With the south of Ireland being by far Northern Ireland's biggest export market, will the Prime Minister state what assessment he has made of the impact leaving the EU would have on the land border within Ireland, whether continued free movement in Ireland can be guaranteed, and the damage that a customs border could have on Northern Ireland's economic security?
Prime Minister.
Well, I think the Honourable Lady asks important questions, and I think I'm right in saying that in the amendments to the European referendum bill that were agreed in the House of Lords and then I think accepted here, there's a series of documents that the government has to produce on the reform proposals, on the alternatives to membership, and on the obligations and rights of membership of the European Union. And I think through the process of these documents we should address this very important question, which clearly affects one part of the United Kingdom quite intensely.
Mr. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 2014-15, 183,000 economic migrants came from the European Union, none of whom would be deterred by anything we've heard so far. Ever closer union may be taken out of the preamble, but it remains in the essential text of all of the treaties. On protecting the euro out, all that will happen is that there will be a discussion, and there are plenty of discussions in the European Union. And on competitiveness, that's been part of the European Union's own ambition since the Lisbon Agenda of 1999. The thin gruel has been further watered down, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend has a fortnight, I think, in which to salvage his reputation as a negotiator.
Prime Minister.
Let me, my honourable friend is extremely articulate and always speaks very powerfully, but let me just take two of the points that he makes and say why I think actually he's got this wrong. First of all, the principles that will be legally binding in terms of how currencies other than the euro are treated, that is a real advance. That means, for instance, never again can the European Union suggest that you can only have the clearance of euros in Eurozone countries. That would have been disastrous for our financial services industry. So I've secured that. They can't even promote that again. And that's so important because, of course, if we weren't in the European Union, we wouldn't have that protection at all. They could change that rule like that. And I think he doesn't understand the power of the principles of no discrimination, no disadvantage, and no cost, so we can't be forced to bail out Eurozone countries, as we nearly were last summer. That is powerful. And on ever closer union, I would encourage him to look at section C, page 9 of these documents, where it says the references to an ever closer union do not offer a base for extending the scope of any provision of the treaties. Now, as I've said, as far as I can remember, and I was advising a minister when we had the Maastricht debates, and I sat through watching Lisbon and Nice and Amsterdam and the rest, this has never been set out that way. This means you can't use ever closer union to drive a process of integration. Now, if we've got in this House the protection that we have to have a referendum if any minister ever suggests we sign up to another treaty that passes power, protection 1, and we've got this, we're well on our way to saying that our different sort of membership of the EU is not only safeguarded, but it's being extended, because not only are we out of the euro, out of Schengen, but we're also out of ever closer union too.
Jack Dromey. Mr. Speaker, once the workshop of the world, Birmingham in the West Midlands is now the industrial heartland of Britain. Key to that success is inward investment, including that of the 3,000-strong Jaguar factory in my constituency. Key to inward investment is continuing membership of the European Union. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that it is strongly in the best interests of Midland workers that we remain part of Europe?
Prime Minister.
Well, provided we get the agreement that we need, yes, of course I do. I think that we are seeing an industrial renaissance in the West Midlands, a lot of it around the automotive industry. I've had a number of meetings with car manufacturers in recent days. I saw Toyota and Ford yesterday. I've had conversations with Jaguar Land Rover and others. I was with BMW recently in Germany, and they all make the point that Britain is a great centre for manufacturing of cars and particularly of engines, and this comes to the point about the standards set in Europe and being a rule maker, not a rule taker. That's very important for our auto industry.
Mr. John Barron.
Following the Prime Minister's response to my recent PMQ, I've taken his advice and cleared the diary for a debate tomorrow in this chamber on parliamentary sovereignty. Given the importance of sovereignty to the EU negotiations, will he join us in that debate and perhaps respond on behalf of the government?
I'm very sorry. I haven't been able to clear my diary. Tomorrow I have the Syria conference, and that's many people are coming here tonight. I think we've got over 30 presidents and prime ministers, and the aim of trying to raise twice as much for the Syria refugee appeal this year as we did last year. But I know my honourable friend is keen to have a word, and I will make sure that we fix that up.
Debbie Abrahams.
Mr. Speaker, there are 14,000 jobs in Oldham that are dependent on Europe, so I'm very much in favour that we remain. But the Prime Minister mentioned in his statement that the emergency brake would apply immediately after the EU referendum, and yet it was reported yesterday that it will be at least 18 months. So could he clarify which it is, and if he will report on any other transitional arrangements for other measures?
No, what I said is that because this is not relying on changes to the treaty, but is going to be European legislation, it can enter into force relatively shortly after the referendum. It will require some legislation. The leader, as I said, I think a bit earlier, of one of the biggest parties in the European Parliament said it could be a matter of months because you can accelerate the process. But it just goes to show how much we need to bind everyone into this agreement that we hope to achieve in the coming weeks so that the Parliament is able to pass this legislation as swiftly as possible.
Nick Herbert.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that one of the biggest concerns about the direction of travel in the European Union is that there are countries within it, the Eurozone members, who wish to integrate more deeply in order to protect their currency,
We have our own currency, but it was an incredibly important part of my right honourable friend's negotiation ambition that we should be protected from any discriminatory measure that might result from their ability to integrate more closely. Is that not why this proposed package is indeed significant? That it does protect us and that we now not just have the position of two different speeds, but actually a different destination from our European partners, and that gives us a relatively advantageous position.
Well, I'll make 2 points. First of all, this reference to a different destination, I think that is significant. People have often talked about Europe moving at different speeds, but for the first time, this is saying we may not all be trying to achieve the same ends, and I think that is very important. On the Euro ins-out section, it's probably the most technical and in some ways the most impenetrable, but there are some simple principles, like the non-discrimination, no-cost principles that I referred to my honourable friend for North East Somerset. But there's also a very important concept in there that should we need to take action in terms of financial supervision to secure our own financial stability, nothing should get in the way of that. And that, I think, is very important clarification for the good of our country.
Phil Wilson.
Over 80% of businesses in my constituency want to stay in the EU. Over 50% of the jobs are linked to trade with the EU. Our membership is vital for jobs, prosperity and security. That is why this side of the House is united to campaign to stay in Europe. And don't we need now to end the uncertainty and have the referendum as soon as possible and campaign to stay in the EU?
Well, obviously, I'm keen to end the uncertainty, but I'm not in any hurry if we can't get the right deal. I think we've set out very clearly what needs to be done. I think that is possible for it to be agreed in February, but if it takes longer, we'll have to make sure we are patient, because getting this right really matters.
Mr. Peter Bone.
Mr. Speaker, a week or so ago, 2,500 people turned up at Kettering to the first GO conference, which is a grassroots organisation to get out of the EU, and we had cross-party speakers at it, and we're doing the same thing in Manchester. Mr. Speaker, the thing that hasn't been commentated on, and I had an email from the Prime Minister about this yesterday, was the fact that he rules nothing out. This is a process, and he might not get what he wants. Now, I understand he won't be able to come to Manchester because he's still in the negotiations, but could he come on February the 19th to our GO conference then, if he doesn't get what he wants? And would it be possible for me to drop off a tie at Downing Street for him?
My honourable friend is always very generous with his time, with his advice, and now also with his clothing. I think the tie is here. I feel the blazer is soon to follow. But I won't be able to come, I don't think, on February the 19th. I hope I will still be in the thick of negotiations, but I would, of course, report back to this House and give the results.
It's a very garish item, I'm bound to say. But who am I to object to that?
Would you like one, sir?
I've suddenly been afflicted by a loss of hearing. Sammy Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hope my tie's not too garish for you. When the Prime Minister visits Northern Ireland, I welcome it. Will he visit the devastated fishing villages, the families who are angered by EU court rulings on terrorist decisions, manufacturers who are smothered in red tape, and haulage companies whose employees run the gauntlet at Calais every week because of the EU chaotic immigration policy? And would he explain to them how his red card will stop any further destructive EU legislation when it requires him to get, in 12 weeks, 50% of parliaments across the EU to oppose proposals which are backed by their own governments?
When I come to Northern Ireland, I want to address all of those issues. I think when we look at the reform that we've already had of the common fisheries policy, that has led to some improvement, but there's more to be done. When we look at the rules that manufacturers face, I've set out here today how we're going to cut bureaucracy. I think we also, in terms of one of the problems that's been happening between the Republic and Northern Ireland in terms of sham marriages and people trying to get round our immigration controls, that is expressly addressed in these documents, but we need now to carry them into force.
Tom Pursglove.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And whilst the Prime Minister is trying his best to renegotiate the position, would he not agree that the reforms as they stand do nothing to make the immigration system in this country fairer, regardless of where people come from in the world?
Minister.
Well, I think they do make it fairer because you know, for years, as I explained in my statement, for years it's been frustrating that we can't apply some of the rules we apply to British citizens marrying foreign nationals to European Union citizens marrying foreign nationals. And what this agreement does is open up the way to make sure that we do. And so all sorts of sham marriages and fraudsters and criminals and others who've been getting round our immigration controls will no longer be able to.
Anna Cherry.
The Sunday Times has reported that as part of these negotiations, the Prime Minister is seeking to deny UK citizens access to the fundamental rights guaranteed by the EU Charter as part of his plan to restore the sovereignty of Parliament. Does he appreciate of sovereignty of Parliament as a distinctively English principle? In Scotland, the people are sovereign and they don't want, stated in the well-known case of McCormick against the Lord Advocate, their human rights protections to be reduced.
What I would say is that people in our country have had fundamental rights long before the European Union Charter of Fundamental Rights was even thought of. And so we don't need to have these sort of documents in force in Britain because we've got our own Parliament, our own rights, and soon we'll have our own British Bill of Rights too.
Nadeem Zahawi.
Speaker, constituents and families at home will be thinking about what the future holds, and I think all 4 tranches of this agreement are important to all our constituents, but the most significant is this protection for non-Euro countries. Will the Prime Minister assure this House that he will look at the detail, because it is the devil in the detail, there are no loopholes, as the Eurozone countries integrate, that we are protected and we aren't discriminated against?
Minister.
I will certainly do that. It is going to be a complex negotiation, this, because obviously the Eurozone countries want to be able to integrate more, and they want to know that we're not trying to block the necessary action that they need to take. But clearly what we want to make sure is that we're not disadvantaged as being single.
I'm sure the Prime Minister will welcome today's news of the largest offshore wind farm in the world is to be built off the issue
market members.
Diana Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, Yorkshire coast by Dong Energy and Siemens, creating up to 2,000 jobs in the Humber estuary and investing £6 billion. So doesn't this show that whatever the debate and frustrations around the right terms, it's in our country's economic interest to be part of and engaged in the EU as a leading player?
Well, I'm delighted with the news because this government has given great support to Siemens and to Dong Energy, and we have, I think, the biggest offshore wind market anywhere in the world because we've given the regulatory certainty that industry needed, and what it's, I think, achieving in the east of England is actually not just one big factory, but actually an industrial regeneration of all the industries that relate to it. But irrespective of the outcome of this referendum, we've got to make sure Britain is the best place in the world to invest and grow a business. I'm sure when the arguments come, there'll be many who want to see us stay in a reformed European Union, making the argument that will make us even more attractive. But we should wait until the starting gun is fired.
Neil Carmichael.
Mr. Speaker, the scope and scale of this reform package does actually reflect the key interests of a widespread range of people across this chamber. And so does the Prime Minister agree with me that the important thing now is to make sure that it is legally binding, make sure the details are absolutely right, but above all, sketch out the case for the economic reasons why we need to be in the European Union, not least the fact that more than half of our foreign direct investment comes from the European Union?
I think my honourable friend is right. Look, the next few weeks is going to be about trying to secure this deal, nail down all the details, and then if that is successful, there'll then be the bigger arguments that he refers to.
Mr. Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you. I suspect there will always be issues that divide the Prime Minister and myself, but on this isn't the thing that matters, the national interest and what the Prime Minister has described in his statement as that greater prize. Isn't one of the real issues and the real benefits of having a document that is legally binding and then ratified by the British people in a referendum, that it will be the British people who decide, and that had the Prime Minister gone for a treaty change, that would have been potentially scuppered by referendums in France, in the Netherlands, in Ireland and in other EU member states whose public might have come to a different view to the British public?
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable member for what he says. Clearly, this is a legally binding arrangement, if it's agreed, for the reasons that I've given. But within it, we are aiming for treaty change, for those things that need to change the next time the treaties are altered. But I think he makes a good point, is the more we can bring this together in one place and explain what it's about, the more that the British people will be able to see the force of the arguments.
Mr David Nuttall.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Does the Prime Minister accept that if the United Kingdom left the European Union, we would be able to regain our seat at the World Trade Organization, thereby regaining our voice and influence on this crucial body for global trade, which we lost by being a member of the European Union?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right that, of course, outside the EU, one of the options would be to take our seat at the World Trade Organization. I think the only problem with that is the World Trade Organization hasn't actually signed many trade agreements in recent years. They've tended to be bilateral agreements. So you've got the EU agreement with Canada that we hope is just about to come in, the EU agreement with Korea. Now, of course, Britain could independently go and sign trade agreements, but we have to weigh up the arguments of how much weight does Britain have as a member of the European Union, part of a market of 500 million people, when you're trying to negotiate the biggest and the best trade deals with the fastest growing countries of the world.
Brendan O'Hara. Mr O'Hara. No, he's not here. He was here. I think it's Stuart McDonald.
Mr Speaker, the German government and the European car lobby see this renegotiation as an opportunity to water down new proposals on emission standards and type approval. Does the Prime Minister accept that would be unacceptable to British drivers, and will they ensure that that will not be a bargaining chip in this renegotiation?
There's no connection between this renegotiation and those directives. The only connection that I can see is the one I was making earlier, which is that Britain needs to be in the room when these decisions are made for the good of our car industry and for our consumers.
Dr Sarah Wollaston.
Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister has set out that he wants that there are many things that remain to be reformed. But if this grudging and threadbare deal is the very best that the EU are prepared to concede to us, what serious hope is there of meaningful renegotiation once we're tied in, or if and when we're tied in long term under a referendum?
Well, I'd make 2 points to my honourable friend. I mean, first of all, this is not coming at the time of a more general treaty change. This is a one-off. This is the first thing. This is the first government, first Prime Minister that I can think of that from a standing start has achieved a unilateral agreement for the good of their country inside the EU. And I don't think it's threadbare. I think, as others have said, it's very solid. Now, of course, there will be, I'm sure, treaty changes in the EU coming down the track. And as I've said, the process of reform is never fully completed. But the other thing I'd say to her is there's no danger after this agreement being signed, and I would hope confirmed in a referendum, there's no danger of Europe then running away with a whole lot of other plans for Britain, because we've got that referendum locked. Nothing can happen to Britain without a referendum in this country. That was such an important piece of legislation back in 2010, and I think sometimes we've forgotten about it.
Greg Mulholland.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Liberal Democrats believe in the United Kingdom being in Europe, but we also believe in the European Union being reformed. So I congratulate the Prime Minister and his team and wish them well in the remaining negotiations. When he is leading the campaign to stay in, will he remind the British public of the mutual defence clause, and that, frankly, in this unstable world, now would be an absurd time to turn our backs on our nearest neighbours and allies?
Well, I think this will be an important... Thank you very much for your good wishes for the final stages of this renegotiation. I think that this will be a big argument, I'm sure, in the campaign. Like many on this side of the House, I've always seen NATO as the cornerstone of our defence. But as I've said earlier, in the modern networked world, the work you do, for instance, in the Mediterranean to try and stop people leaving Libya and making the perilous journey to Italy, that could be a NATO operation, but right now it's a European operation in which Britain is playing a leading part. And so being a member of networks where you can work together for your security is important.
Caroline Noakes.
SMEs are the absolute lifeblood of our economy,
and small business owners in Romsey and Southampton North are looking at the targets for regulation reduction with optimism. But what they are really seeking is a reassurance from my right honourable friend that these are stretch targets, and our real goal has to be to go beyond them and make sure there is a real terms reduction in the amount of bureaucracy small businesses face.
Prime Minister.
My honourable friend is absolutely right. What's been achieved so far is something like an 80% reduction in the number of proposals coming forward, but of course what we want to achieve is actually a reduction in the existing base of regulation and legislation where it's unnecessary. And that, again, for the first time, is what we have secured targets towards.
Cat Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Prime Minister confirm that British women's rights at work, specifically around paid maternity leave, equal pay and anti-discrimination laws, will remain firmly in place and won't be affected by any deal? And for the same British women, can I ask for an update on how far his negotiations have got on the tampon tax?
First of all, I can give her that reassurance, and not only are those guarantees, but also the action we've taken domestically on things like shared parental leave, which I'm very proud of and makes Britain a more family-friendly country. In terms of the tampon tax, this is difficult because of the VAT rules in Europe, so I have nothing to add to what I've said before about this, but I totally agree about the desirability of trying to get it fixed.
Ben Howlett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I join other colleagues in thanking the Prime Minister for his work in negotiating a better deal for Britain in the European Union. I agree with him that these reforms are a substantial and fundamental change to our relationship with the European Union. But what assessment has he made of the impact of these reforms on the car manufacturing worker, the student who's looking at their Erasmus placement next year, as well as those who are concerned, and the constituent of mine who contacted me yesterday, the pensioner, to say, what is the impact of my grandchild if we left the European Union?
Well, I think my honourable friend is absolutely right. Inevitably, these negotiations, they focus on important ideas and concepts of sovereignty and non-discrimination and deregulation and all the rest of it. But, we have to make sure this is a debate that's about consumers and how we're affected in terms of freedom to travel, freedom to study, the price of flights, the availability of roaming charges and all the rest of it, how we're affected, as he said, as pensioners, as car workers and as young people looking for university places. Hopefully all of the debate will engage and bring out those issues.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has outlined very clearly the action that he has taken in UK-EU negotiation. What is missing from his statement, with great respect, can I say this, is any referral whatsoever to the fishing sectors. Choked with bureaucracy and unable to fish fully the seas around the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, farmers have to wade through red tape just to farm. The fishing sector and the farmers have a solution. It's simple. Have the referendum as soon as possible, and let's rid ourselves of the outrageous and top-heavy EU and just say no to Europe. Can the Prime Minister tell us today, tell the fishermen, tell the farmers, when the referendum will take place?
Well, I can't give a date for the referendum because we don't yet have an agreement in place. I would say that in recent years there have been quite significant improvements in the common fisheries policy, not least dealing with the appalling situation of discards. As for farmers, let the debate begin. Let's hear from farmers and farmers' representatives about what they think, about the support that they get, about the actions we've taken to try and simplify the bureaucracy with fewer inspections and the rest. But I look forward to hearing from all farmers and their representatives.
Flick Drummond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you very much, Prime Minister, for very good negotiations. This report is fantastic. But can I just draw your attention to Section B, and would you welcome Mr. Tusk's report on competitiveness, which says lowering administrative burdens and compliance costs on economic operators, especially small and medium enterprises, and repealing unnecessary legislation, is what so many companies complain about. And this is very welcome to all businesses, particularly those in Portsmouth, who want to invest in Europe, and exactly the reason why we should be staying in a market which has over 500 million people.
Prime Minister.
Can I thank my honourable friend for her remarks? Of course, Section B is important, but it's also worth looking at the draft European Council Declaration on Competitiveness, which adds to Section B and brings out some more detail.
Mark Durkan.
Obviously, any referendum debate will centre on the bigger picture, on the longer-term challenge and deeper interests. But as well as the issues raised by my honourable friend, the member for South Down, can he address whether or not the package that he has come up with, the changes in relation to child benefit, will they automatically extend to cross-border workers in a constituency like mine, where EU precepts do apply?
I will look very carefully at that issue, but I seem to recall from conversations that I had with the Taoiseach, I think there are particular arrangements for the common travel area, but I will come back to the honourable gentleman.
Rob Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The legal certainty which the Prime Minister referred to and the protections in the economic governance section of the document are very important to maintain the status of London as an international business and financial centre. But would my right honourable friend agree with me that one of the risks that would remain if this agreement were not successful to that position will be the uncertainty of leaving a market which we can grow and improve and strengthen, and having then to try and get back into the market from the outside at uncertain cost, time and terms?
Minister. No, well, my honourable friend with his constituency is right to talk about the importance of financial services and indeed of the City of London. We've got 40% of Europe's financial services here in the UK, and the current arrangements work quite well because you can passport your way through to establish yourself in any European country, and so those arguing for alternatives will have to answer some quite difficult questions about how exactly you put those sort of protections in place.
Mr. Peter Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Prime Minister confirm that he is now in receipt of a letter from my right honourable friend from Gordon that makes it absolutely clear that he does not believe 6 weeks is a long enough gap between national elections and the EU referendum? Clearly, the misrepresentation that's happened was not intentional. We all accept that. But in order to set the matter straight, could it suggest that the Prime Minister and his colleagues are equally enthusiastic at circulating the actual views of the former First Minister, in particular his suggestion that the real reason the Prime Minister wants a June referendum is that a short campaign is designed to minimise the extent of the obvious divisions within the Conservative Party?
The Prime Minister.
First of all, I don't think 4 months is a short period of time. I think I think by the end of 4 months, I think people might be heartily sick of the whole subject and think that they've. But I noticed that the thumb screws and the other instruments of torture available to the current First Minister have clearly been applied to the former First Minister. And in a miraculous conversion, 6 weeks was enough, and now 6 weeks is not enough. I wonder what she did to him.
Mr. Richard Drax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I too thank the Prime Minister for giving the country the chance for a referendum? But would you agree with me that he, I and this government are nothing more than tenants whose duty while we serve to protect our island inheritance? That's our democracy, sovereignty and freedom. And that we have no right whatsoever, none whatsoever, to sell it all, let alone cheaply, to a bureaucratic and unaccountable institution like the EU.
No, we are tenants. He's absolutely right, and that's why I think after 40 years of the British people not having a say, when Europe has changed so much, it's right to give the British people a say again. And what I wanted to do was to give them the very best possible chance to have a say, not between the status quo today and leaving altogether, but an improved settlement and plan for Britain, which they can choose to stay in or get out of.
Mr. Tom Elliott, don't be diverted by the honourable gentleman next to you. Mr. Elliott.
Actually not, Mr. Speaker, I would not. And I've no ties to offer either. But the Prime Minister, one of the major drawbacks to businesses in their side of Europe is the red tape and bureaucracy. I did note that within yesterday's documents it said it would be repealing unnecessary legislation in that respect. When will the public, and those businesses in particular, be able to see what legislation is planned to be repealed?
Well, it is, as the document set out, it will be an annual process. And what is different about this is instead of just words about deregulation, there are two mechanisms being put in place. One to enforce subsidiarity so that whole competencies can be returned to member states, and one for burden reduction targets. Those two things are new.
Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On this side of the House, we want what's best for Britain when it comes to jobs and security. I have one vote, and I believe that there are aspects of the EU that need serious scrutiny and reform. My constituents share those thoughts. This party has brought the opportunity for this much-needed referendum and the reality of reform, and we can look at this and examine what is before us. Would the Prime Minister, though, agree that on all sides, open argument on this rather than open warfare is what voters will all want?
No, people do want, they want open argument, and they also want unbiased statistics and clear independent advice as well. So I would, as well as there being an in campaign and an out campaign once the deal is agreed, well, several out campaigns, as you say. We also need to make sure. We also need to make sure that that independent organisations and businesses and NGOs and others who think they would be affected, everyone should be encouraged to come forward and give their view.
Sir Stephen Gethins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, will the Prime Minister tell us, in the spirit of seeing subsidiarity in action, when he says strengthening all national parliaments, what exactly will that mean for the Scottish Parliament?
Well, we're currently giving the Scottish Parliament the immense responsibility over being able to raise its own taxes, which we're still negotiating, but I hope. So this is probably the biggest act in British subsidiarity that we've had for many, many years, and I would urge the SNP to pick up the baton and run with it.
Chris, Phil.
On the topic of in-work benefits, the Prime Minister has already said that the emergency brake is in the hands of the Commission. Would the Prime Minister agree it would greatly help the in-case if over the next 2 or 3 weeks he could get a slightly stronger commitment to apply that handbrake for a period into the future, not just initially? And secondly, on that topic, what would happen if we were to vote to stay in, but the European Parliament then subsequently didn't ratify these measures?
Well, on my honourable friend's latter point, I'd make the point that the European Parliament are a party to these negotiations, and I've had a number of meetings with them. And I think if he looks at the draft declaration of the European Commission on the safeguard mechanism, it's very clear that we are justified in triggering the mechanism straight away. But his other point is absolutely right, that we need to secure in the negotiations the best possible agreement about all the other aspects of the operation of this mechanism, how long it lasts for, how many times it can be renewed, and all the rest of it.
Grady.
There were approximately 500 days between the announcement and the date of the Scottish independence referendum, which is roughly the same length of time between today and the 23rd of June 2017. But there are 30,000 British citizens living in European countries and claiming benefits. So how will this draft permanent, still to be negotiated, legally binding package affect them?
Well, I can let the House into a little secret, which is the reason why there were 500 days between the announcement of the Scottish referendum and the Scottish referendum itself is I was so determined that there was going to be one question and one question only that I granted the former First Minister the right to name the date, and he wanted to make sure it was after as long as possible, after the anniversary of Bannockburn, after the everything, everything you could throw in, and the result was still, I have to say, from my point of view, very, very clear.
Paul Scully.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Benefits as a pull factor for migration may have been blunted somewhat under these proposals, but not eliminated. Arguably, the bigger pull factor for migration is our successful economy and job creation in the UK. But can I ask the Prime Minister what the long-term view is in these draft proposals for UK to be able to control immigration from within the EU beyond the 4 years of the emergency brake?
Well, I think the long-term approach is, first of all, we are dealing with the abuses of free movement in a more comprehensive package than ever before, the fraudsters, the criminals, the sham marriages. We've got this emergency brake, which does deliver a 4-year welfare brake, which I think is significant. And frankly, I'm sure the Eurozone economies over time will start to recover, because that has been one of the issues. In the long term, we need to do better controlling immigration from outside the EU, but we also need a welfare policy and a training policy inside our own country, which increasingly we have, which trains up the people in our own country to do the jobs that our strong economy is providing.
Mr. Robin Walker.
As one of the top 5 economies in the world, Britain has to have a world view, and we need friends and allies, not just in one continent, but in 6. And I agree with the Prime Minister when he says that this should be a question not just about whether we could manage outside the European Union, but about where we are better off. With that in mind, what feedback has he had on his negotiations from our allies in the Commonwealth and Britain's wider networks around the world?
Well, the advice has been pretty comprehensive from all of them, that they value their individual relationship with Britain, but they think we are better off inside a reformed European Union. And, you know, I think whether it's the Prime Ministers of New Zealand or Australia or Canada or the American President or others, they're all pretty clear about this, not simply because they think we're better off, but they also think that the influence we bring to bear on the European Union is positive from their point of view.
Alberto Costa.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The SNP, in rummaging for an argument, referred to a 1953, the case of McCormick, and obiter comments, that is, side-passing comments. Can I remind the Prime Minister that he, among EU leaders, has unique, up-to-date experience of tough negotiations which led to a referendum agreement, which led to 55% of the Scottish electorate voting to keep the sovereign United Kingdom together? Can I say to the Prime Minister that he should take comfort in his success, because those 55% will be voting just like the English, the Welsh and the Northern Irish to listen to the British Premier on what is in Britain's best interest?
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. What I'd say, look, I think what these two referenda have in common is that as a country we should be confronting and dealing with these big issues. Does Scotland want to stay within the United Kingdom, and does the United Kingdom want to stay within a reformed Europe?
Mark Spencer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think just as important as the result is the legitimacy of the result, and a high turnout will be essential. So what can the Prime Minister do to engage with trade, with industry and with businesses to discuss with their employees the implications for whichever way this debate goes?
Well, I will certainly do everything I can in the result of a successful negotiation to encourage engagement at all levels. But I would also encourage businesses and charities and other organisations to make sure they feel they can come forward. There are some in the business community who feel that there's all sorts of corporate governance concerns they have to go through and all the rest of it. I would advise them to get on with that process, so if they think they have important arguments to put forward to their workforce, to their customers, to their shareholders, they're able to do so.
Mr. Richard Graham.
Mr. Speaker, a key question for many is whether the UK can, when we need to, say no to European migrants. And this draft Council statement spells out clearly that we can, on the grounds of public policy, public health or public security, which includes legitimate goals like reducing unemployment or suspicion of marriages of convenience. Would my right honourable friend confirm that this is a considerable step forward for our own immigration and security interests?
Yes, I think my honourable friend makes an important point, and I think actually if you read section D of the main document, I think it does actually, it's quite refreshing about how many instances it says there are possible for the control of migration and for the limitation of free movement, and I think it bears a careful reading.
Mr. Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the Prime Minister's statement so far, and in particular the fact that for the first time in my lifetime, the Prime Minister is doing a deal in Europe and coming back to this country and giving the whole British people a chance to have a say on it, not just members of Parliament. In terms of moving on, even if this, would you reassure me that even if people do vote to remain in the European Union on the basis of this deal, that we will still be having a vision that Europe should be doing less and doing it better?
I absolutely agree with that. The idea of Europe only where necessary, but nation-states wherever possible, is absolutely right. And let me say again, you know, because there will be people who will say, look, OK, maybe these issues, we've addressed some issues of concern to the British people, but there's more to be done. That's a perfectly acceptable view. I would argue the more to be done should be done from inside the EU rather than by slamming the door and trying to do it from outside.
Mark Pawsey.
Mr. Speaker, it's now clear from the renegotiations that Britain can improve its position within Europe by continuing to benefit from influence over a market of 500 million people while maintaining our borders and preventing abuse of free movement. May I ask the Prime Minister whether he's as encouraged as I am by the very positive support that's come from business across the piece?
Well, I think it is important that business raises its voice. Particularly as regards jobs and investment. You know, we need to demonstrate that this negotiation and this outcome can actually lead to a stronger, more secure economy, not just for the sake of business, but for the sake of people who want security.
Mr. Cartledge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I congratulate my right honourable friend on his statement. Is he aware
that 90% of FTSE 100 chairmen would vote to remain in the European Union? And does he think that this is because they're part of some so-called Project Fear? Or is it because they run our very largest companies in the real world, and they know that a vote to leave is a vote for huge economic uncertainty, and a vote to remain, with the protections we will have in terms of the single market and our currency, is a vote for our economy to go from strength to strength?
Well, I think it is important that we hear the voice of business, both large and small, and I encourage all of them to speak out, because I think they've got an important contribution to make to the debate. And I think the more people can give concrete examples of how access to this market matters and access to the rules of this market matters, I think the better.
Mike Wood. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Prime Minister for his efforts to secure the best deal available. But today's newspaper reports suggest that the changes needed to introduce an emergency brake would require approval from the European Parliament. Has he had an opportunity to assess levels of support amongst MEPs for these changes?
Well, yes, my honourable friend is right. Obviously, it is a great advance that the European Commission has said Britain qualifies for this break, that it should be brought, if it existed now, it would be brought in straight away. In terms of the advice I have about the position of the European Parliament, I mentioned earlier, I think the head of the largest group in the European Parliament thinks that this could be sorted out in a matter of months and is supportive of the approach.
Mr. Andrew Bridgen.
Mr. Speaker, the German captain of the ship which is the European Union has deliberately steered it into a migration iceberg with all the watertight doors open. Rather than just rearranging the deck chairs, wouldn't it be better rather to direct the British people to the available lifeboat while the band's still playing before the inevitable happens?
Hear, hear.
I think the analogy was getting quite complicated there, but I don't agree with that. Look, if we weren't in Schengen, if we were not outside Schengen, I think my honourable friend would have a very fair point. But we're in, we have this situation of being able to have the best of both worlds. Let's keep our borders. Let's not let in foreign nationals that don't have a right to be here, something that's strengthened by this agreement, but let's keep the free movement so British people can live and work in other European countries. That, I think, is the best of both worlds.
Craig McKinley. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If I can just press my right honourable friend a little further about the emergency brake. It sounded so hopeful some weeks ago, and the honourable member from Gainsborough, described a backstreet drivers. But the concept of 28 feet reaching for the pedal, all wanting an influence, really means that when a hazard is seen, indecision will mean that an accident will surely happen. Would my right honourable friend agree that it is far better to have independent control of the brake, the clutch, the accelerator, and indeed the steering wheel?
What I'd say to my honourable friend is, first of all, the European Commission statement is very, very clear. It considers the kind of information provided to it by the United Kingdom shows that the exceptional situation exists in the United Kingdom today. So that would enable us to pull this brake to make sure that people couldn't get instant access to our welfare benefits. But there is another consideration that those thinking that we're better off outside the European Union have to think about, which is all those, or most of those countries outside the EU that want a close relationship with it, when they ask for free access to the single market, the first demand is that there should also be the free movement of people. That is the case with Norway, for instance. So, this is a deal from within. And I think in many ways, even on this issue, would be better than a deal from without.
Kevin Hollinrake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In his statement, the Prime Minister outlines the work we have done to tackle migration from outside the EU. What conversations has he had with other European leaders about what they're doing to tackle the migrant crisis? Because many of my constituents are very worried about the future implications for migration, particularly when we are seeing such unsustainable levels into the UK at the moment.
I think my honourable friend asks an absolutely crucial question that needs to have a full and proper answer, because of course the arrival of these people onto the European continent does concern people. And what I'd say is, first of all, we don't have to allow into our country foreign nationals resident in other states. That's why we keep our border controls. And if you take, for example, the situation in Germany, in order to get German citizenship, that can take as much as 10 years. Is the product of a lot of work and a lot of tests and everything else. So I think we A, must keep our Schengen no borders agreement. B, should continue to exclude people if they're not European Union citizens and they don't have a visa. And C, the changes here that mean we can crack down on the fraudsters, the criminals, the sham marriages, and those who are trying to get round our immigration controls, puts us in a much better place to deal with the pressures of the future.
Mr. Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's been a long wait, but the voice of the humble will not be silenced, as the Prime Minister said last week. The Prime Minister rightly said in his opening remarks that the British people are proud of their democratic institutions. But can I suggest to him that when they see British ministers having to go cap in hand to Brussels to determine who receives benefits or who's allowed into the country, that pride is somewhat diminished? Could I urge him further in his final negotiations to remain robust and achieve even more? And though I'm afraid he won't persuade me, he may persuade a few doubting people in Cleethorpes to vote to stay.
Well, I'm sure the voice of the humble could help me with that if he really wanted to. Look, Britain is the member of a number of international organisations, some of which involve us having obligations towards them. We have ceded some of our sovereignty and our obligations to NATO, and yet we don't see that as a cap-in-hand issue. We see it as a cornerstone of our security. What I'm trying to secure here with Europe is that we're in the things we want to be in and we're out of the things we don't want to be in. And if that's the case, we're not weaker as a result, we're not less powerful as a result, we're not less sovereign as a result. We're more able to get things done for the people who put us here.
Absolutely. No. I'm always very keen to hear the Honourable Member for Gravesham, but he only toddled into the chamber some considerable way into the statement. As his puckish grin testifies, we'll hear from the Honourable Member on a subsequent occasion. And perhaps we can just thank the Prime Minister for his patience and his courtesy. And I'd like to thank all colleagues for taking part. Look, there will be many opportunities further to debate these important matters, but thanks where they're due. I think we come now to the 10-minute rule motion, which the Honourable Member for Mitcham and Morden has been so patiently waiting. 10-minute rule motion, Siobhan McDonough.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I'm sure all honourable members will agree, it is our job in this House to make sure that the citizens we represent can truly exercise their democratic rights. But as we speak, British citizens in this country are being marginalised and excluded from the democratic process. The problem is less getting people to sign up and more about maintaining people's registration. The people who are being excluded from the process are exactly the people we need to be prioritising. According to recent trends, we are witnessing further marginalisation of already marginalised groups, including those from poorer backgrounds, those who are disabled, and those from ethnic minorities. Research published just yesterday showed that pensioners in the shires who own their own homes have a 90% chance of being on the electoral register. But at the same time, a young man from an ethnic minority background in private rented accommodation in a city has less than a 10% chance of being registered. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister has launched an important drive against, and I quote, overt, unconscious or institutional racial discrimination in university admissions, the justice system and the police. But the fact that people from ethnic minorities are far less likely to be registered to exercise their democratic rights undermines the government's commitment. When it comes to electoral registration, the picture is bleak across the country. I celebrate the work of my honourable friend, the member for Ashfield, for raising the issue of voters dropping off the register since the introduction of individual electoral registration, or IER for short. Since its introduction, a staggering 800,000 people have dropped off the register. That's 1.8% nationwide. To put these figures into context, Liverpool has seen a drop in its eligible register of 14,000, Birmingham 17,000 and Lewisham 6,000. And these are all areas which have seen an increase in population. The situation is even worse in areas where the population is transient, such as university towns. Canterbury has seen a huge 13% drop in those registered to vote. Cambridge has a drop of 11%, meaning its electorate is now smaller than it was in 2011. These drops are the result of the absurdities of the current system. Imagine if every time you started a new job, you needed to apply for a new NI number and needed to prove to the HMRC again and again that you were eligible to pay tax and national insurance. The process would be cumbersome, costly and repetitive, just as the process of IER is. In sum, these developments mean that British citizens, particularly those who are at the sidelines, are being disenfranchised and denied their democratic rights. This also means that as the pool of potential voters decreases, our political status quo becomes more limited. If the government is serious about combating social exclusion, it urgently needs to review the dire situation. Disenfranchisement is marginalising the already marginalised. Being on the electoral register is the closest thing we have to a civic contract. But if you're not on the register, you won't have access to mainstream loans and you might not be able to get a mortgage. You also can't serve on a jury and be part of our justice process. More fundamentally of all, if you're not on the electoral register, you can't participate in the democratic process. Our present system of electoral registration is fundamentally flawed, nor is it cheap, with IER costing at least about £108 million to roll out. But it doesn't have to be this way. Automatic electoral registration provides the opportunity to reduce costs and improve administration, cut down on bureaucracy, and enable everyone to access their right to enfranchisement. This bill is a statement of common sense, proposing a cheaper, simpler and more effective model. It places a responsibility on the state to do everything in its power to ensure that the electoral database is full and complete. It imposes a duty on the government and public bodies to work better together. It proposes to make the system truly convenient for the citizens by integrating national and local data sets. This will mean that an individual's address details would be automatically updated according to trusted data sets. The trusted data sets would collate information at each point that a citizen interacts with the state, whether it's when they pay tax, receive a benefit, use the NHS or claim a pension. The walls between these data sets used to be sacrosanct, but they are falling away more and more as the government prioritises security and anti-fraud measures. For instance, housing benefit departments already use the electoral register to find households claiming the 25% single-person council tax discount, but have more than one voter registered. This demonstrates the huge potential when government departments and public bodies communicate with one another. These reforms would vastly improve registration and have been tested elsewhere. A very similar model operates in Australia with huge success. For instance, the state of Victoria has a population of 3.5 million people and has a 95% accuracy in its registration process. It does this at extremely low cost, employing just 5 members of staff who maintain the rolling register. Rolling out this reform in the UK is timely for so many reasons. Greater Manchester will submit to the Cabinet Office next week its plans to pioneer this system of automatic electoral registration and its proposals for a pilot scheme. I sincerely hope that the Government will support these plans and will introduce the primary legislation around data sharing that is needed to ensure the pilot can go ahead. And I am sure honourable members will be aware that this week is Bite the Ballot's National Voter Registration Drive. Last year's drive saw almost 500,000 people register to vote, making it the most successful voter registration campaign ever. I hope that the results this week will match that achievement. But in the long run, voter registration should not be the responsibility of charities or NGOs. It should be down to the state to do all it can and ensure everyone, especially those who are most marginalised, can access their democratic rights. I hope honourable members will consider this a non-partisan issue and will agree with me that it's in all our interest to get more people signed up. And then we can all get on with our job as representatives of political parties to try and persuade and enthuse voters that we are worthy of their votes. At a time when social exclusion is getting worse, voter turnout is declining, and IER has caused registration to deplete, automatic voter registration has never been more important. Voting is the backbone of this House, and it's one of the most important interactions between the citizen and the democratic state. It is a fundamental symbol of engagement. It signifies that you are not on the margins of society, but are part of the majority. We can no longer accept a system that excludes and marginalises potential voters, not least because they are exactly the groups we need to engage with to end social exclusion. I don't think it's controversial to argue that voting is not just for the elite. It is something we should all be able to access. That's why, for the sake of our democracy and of social cohesion, I hope the government will be supporting my suggestions and will make registering to vote more, not less, a way of life.
The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As many as that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. The ayes have it. Who will prepare and bring in the bill?
Ian Austin, Dawn Butler, Rosie Cooper, Jim Dowd, Jim Fitzpatrick, Mr George Howarth, Chris Leslie, Mari Rimmer, Joan Ryan, Mr Sharma and Ruth Smeeth, and myself.
Siobhan MacDonald.
Yeah.
Automatic electoral registration bill.
Second reading, what day?
Friday, 5th of February, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Friday the 5th of February. We now come to the motion in the name of the Leader of the Opposition on tax avoidance and multinational companies. Mr John MacDonald.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Speaker, I wish to move the motion set out on the order paper in my name and that of several of my honourable friends. Can I welcome the Minister responding today? Truly sympathise with his position, having been placed in this situation by the Chancellor. I understand the Chancellor is in Rome today. If his trip is associated with the current EU negotiations, can I say at this stage it's unfortunate to say